Armageddon stands as a testament to humanity's industrial might and stubborn persistence in the face of a hostile galaxy. This hive world's strategic importance cannot be overstated. Armageddon serves as both a bulwark against incursions from the galactic east and a vital manufacturing center supporting Imperial military operations across multiple sectors. The planet's surface bears the scars of human industry stretched across millennia. Vast hive cities punctuate the landscape, each one a mountain of plasteel and rockcrete housing billions of souls. Between these urban colossi stretch endless wastelands of polluted ash and chemical deserts, the bitter price of Armageddon's productivity. The northern continent, Armageddon Prime, and the southern landmass, Armageddon Secundus, contain the majority of the world's manufacturing capacity, connected by a narrow equatorial land bridge known as the Isthmus. Within the hives, countless large industrial complexes churn out an impressive array of military material: Chimera transports, Leman Russ battle tanks, Basilisk artillery pieces, and mountains of lasguns, flak armor, and ammunition. The output of a single hive city can equip dozens of Imperial Guard regiments, while the entire planet's production supports war efforts across hundreds of light years. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains a significant presence on Armageddon, their red-robed tech priests ensuring that the intricate machinery of production continues its relentless pace without interruption. This industrial powerhouse operated under the nominal leadership of planetary governor Hermann von Straub, scion of the von Straub dynasty that had ruled Armageddon for generations. Von Straub embodied the worst aspects of imperial nobility: arrogant, incompetent, and utterly convinced of his own brilliance despite mounting evidence to the contrary. His governance focused primarily on maintaining his family's wealth and prestige while neglecting the planet's defenses and infrastructure. The planetary defense force under his command was under strength, poorly equipped, and lacking in proper training protocols. Vital orbital defense platforms sat in various states of disrepair, their machine spirits neglected by inadequate maintenance rituals. The Administratum had noted these deficiencies in multiple assessments, dispatching increasingly urgent warnings to the governor's palace in Hive Tartarus. These communications detailed the strategic vulnerability of Armageddon and demanded immediate rectification of the defense shortfalls. Von Straub dismissed these warnings as bureaucratic meddling, filing them away without action. His contempt for imperial oversight would prove catastrophic as events unfolded in the latter half of 444th year of the 41st millennium. While von Straub indulged in his palatial excesses, ancient forces stirred in the Imperium. To understand the threat that would soon engulf Armageddon, one must look back to the darkest chapter of imperial history, the Horus Heresy. Among the Primarchs who turned against the Emperor during that cataclysmic civil war, few embodied rage and bloodlust more completely than Angron, Lord of the World Eater's Legion. Created alongside his brother Primarchs in the Emperor's gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains on Terra, Angron's fate was perhaps sealed before he ever met his creator. After being scattered through the warp by unknown powers, Angron landed on the world of Nuceria, where he was enslaved and implanted with the Butcher's Nails, archaeotech devices that amplified aggression while suppressing all other emotions. These neural implants transformed him into a creature of pure rage, forever denied peace or satisfaction. When the Emperor discovered Angron, he took the Primarch from Nuceria, but left his fellow slave gladiators to die in their final rebellion. This abandonment created a wound in Angron's psyche that never healed, planting the seeds of resentment that Horus would later exploit. As commander of the 12th Legion, renamed the World Eaters under his leadership, Angron encouraged his Astartes to undergo the same Butcher's Nails implantation, transforming an already fearsome fighting force into berserkers who reveled in bloodshed and carnage. During the Horus Heresy, the World Eaters descended into ever greater savagery. The Legion abandoned all pretense of discipline or tactical acumen, becoming a horde of blood-maddened killers who lived only for close combat and slaughter. When Horus's rebellion failed at Terra, Angron and his legion retreated into the Eye of Terror along with the other traitor legions, but their story did not end there. Within that realm of madness where the Imperium bleeds into real space, Angron's rage and bloodlust drew the attention of Khorne, the chaos god of blood, war, and murder. The Blood God saw in Angron a perfect avatar for his endless wrath, and so the Primarch was elevated, or damned, to become a demon prince. His mortal form was cast aside as warp energy reshaped him into something both more and less than human, a towering crimson entity with great leathery wings, brass armor fused to his flesh, and a face locked in a perpetual snarl of hatred. This transformation occurred somewhere around the early 31st millennium, and for nearly 10,000 years afterward, Angron dwelled primarily within the realm of chaos, leading Khorne's armies in the endless wars of the great game between the Chaos Gods. Occasionally, he would manifest in real space during periods of significant warp activity, bringing ruin to Imperial worlds before being banished back to the Imperium. Each manifestation required tremendous energy and specific conditions, alignment of warp currents, significant bloodshed to weaken reality's fabric, or ritual preparations by cultists. The events leading to Angron's arrival on Armageddon began in the early months of the year 444 of the 41st millennium, when astropathic choirs across Segmentum Solar reported increasing disturbances in the warp. Navigator houses noted unusual current patterns, with established routes becoming treacherous or impassable. The Scholastica Psychona documented a 23% increase in psyker manifestations and spontaneous warp phenomena across the segmentum. By mid-444, a series of warp storms had formed in the vicinity of the Armageddon sector. These tempests in the Imperium grew in intensity over the following months, disrupting interstellar commerce and communication. Merchant vessels reported sightings of strange phenomena in the void, ghostly apparitions visible through viewports, chronometric anomalies where time seemed to slow or accelerate, and crew members experiencing vivid nightmares featuring brass-armored giants wading through oceans of blood. The Inquisition's Ordo Malleus recognized these signs as potential precursors to demonic incursion. Inquisitor Horst dispatched warnings to all planetary governors in the affected region, ordering increased vigilance and the implementation of anti-warp protocols. These directives included enhanced screening for chaos cultist activity, deployment of sanctioned psychers to monitor for Immaterium breaches, and preparation of consecrated munitions effective against warp entities. On Armageddon itself, the warning signs multiplied as the year progressed. The Hive cities experienced power fluctuations that the Mechanicus engine seers could not explain. Instances of mass hysteria erupted in the Underhives, with thousands of citizens reporting identical nightmares of a red giant descending from a tier in the sky. Commissars noted an uptick in violent incidents among Imperial Guard regiments stationed on the planet, with soldiers falling into uncontrollable rages over minor provocations. The Ecclesiarchy's priests reported that sacred oils in cathedral censers would occasionally boil without heat, while statues of imperial saints wept what appeared to be blood. In the wastes between hives, nomadic ash waste tribes observed strange formations in the polluted skies, cloud patterns that resembled screaming faces or symbolic arrangements of stars that corresponded to no known constellation. By the 9th month of the 444th year of the 41st millennium, the warp storms surrounding the Armageddon sector had intensified to the point where astropathic communication became nearly impossible. The few messages that did penetrate the interference were fragmented and distorted, often containing disturbing imagery rather than coherent information. The Navigator houses declared all routes to Armageddon extremis hazardous, effectively cutting the planet off from reinforcement or evacuation. In response to these escalating phenomena, the Administratum issued its most severe warning to Governor von Straub, classified as Vermilion-level threat imminent. The document, bearing the seals of both Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex and Chapter Master Tushen of the Salamanders, outlined specific defensive preparations to be implemented immediately, including the activation of all reserve PDF forces, deployment of orbital defense platforms to maximum readiness, and the evacuation of civilian populations from vulnerable areas. Von Straub's response exemplified his catastrophic leadership. He dismissed the warning as alarmist nonsense and an attempt to undermine planetary authority. Rather than implementing the recommended measures, he reduced PDF patrols to maintain production quotas in the Manufactoria, reasoning that meeting the Administratum's production demands would improve his standing more effectively than wasting resources on phantom threats. The governor's inner circle, comprised largely of sycophants and relatives appointed to positions beyond their competence, reinforced his dismissive attitude. His chief advisor, Lord Xenon Barbadin, characterized the warnings as typical inquisitorial overreach and suggested that the reported phenomena were merely statistical anomalies and mass delusion among the lower classes. The Planetary Defense Commander, General Curtes Mannheim, raised concerns about the military's readiness, but was quickly silenced and reassigned to overseeing agricultural production in the southern ash wastes. Only Cardinal Deckard of the Ecclesiarchy took the warnings seriously, ordering increased prayer vigils and the blessing of water reservoirs throughout the hive cities. His efforts, while well-intentioned, focused more on spiritual preparation than practical defense measures. Without support from the planetary government, these religious observances did little to strengthen Armageddon's material defenses. As the year 444 drew to a close, the veil between real space and the warp had grown perilously thin around Armageddon. The conditions were perfect for a major demonic incursion, a weakened barrier between dimensions, a population experiencing mass psychic disturbance, and planetary defenses neglected to the point of ineffectiveness. All that remained was for something to tear that veil open completely. That catalyst would come from within the warp itself, where Angron, Daemon Primarch of Khorne, gathered his infernal legions. The Blood God had marked Armageddon for conquest, not merely for its strategic value to the Imperium, but for the symbolic victory of claiming a world in the Emperor's home segmentum. Billions of souls would soon find themselves caught between incompetent leadership and one of the most fearsome entities in the galaxy, a collision course set by fate, folly, and the inexorable will of the Chaos Gods. The Warp Rift tore open on the last day of the 444th year of the 41st millennium, a bleeding wound in reality that split the polluted skies above Armageddon's northern wastes. Imperial monitoring stations registered a catastrophic spike in empiric energy as the barrier between dimensions collapsed. The rift expanded outward in pulsing waves, its edges crackling with unnatural energies that distorted light and scorched the already blighted landscape below. Those unfortunate enough to witness the breach firsthand described a gaping maw in the heavens, through which could be glimpsed impossible geometries and writhing shapes that defied comprehension. The first entities to emerge were lesser demons of Khorne, bloodletters with crimson skin and wickedly curved hellblades. They poured through the breach in their thousands, their bestial roars audible for kilometers across the wastelands. Behind them came packs of flesh hounds, demonic beasts that sniffed the air hungrily, already seeking the scent of mortal blood. Juggernaut's massive brass-armored demon steeds thundered onto Armageddon's soil, carrying blood champions who directed the growing horde toward the distant silhouettes of the hive cities. Within hours of the initial breach, the first vessels of the World Eater's Traitor Legion translated from the warp. Ancient battleships and cruisers, their hulls encrusted with 8 millennia of corruption, moved into low orbit. Their once proud imperial designs were now barely recognizable beneath layers of blasphemous iconography, brass skull motifs, riveted armor plates fashioned from the melted-down aquillas of conquered worlds, and great chains that hung from their prows, weighted with the skulls of defeated enemies. The flagship of this terrible fleet was the Conqueror, Angron's personal battle barge since the Great Crusade. Once a proud vessel of the Emperor's expansion, it had become a nightmarish transport for the Blood God's elite. Its hull was stained a permanent rust red from the blood that had been ritually applied to its exterior after each victory, while its interior corridors had been reconfigured into a labyrinthine temple to Khorne, complete with brass altars perpetually slick with fresh sacrifices. From these corrupted vessels came drop pods and assault craft bearing the World Eater's Traitor Legion. Their armor, once pristine white and blue, now displayed the red and brass of their patron god, adorned with skulls, chains, and trophies harvested from fallen enemies. Many had modified their power armor with spikes and blades, transforming their very silhouettes into weapons. Their helmets had been reshaped to resemble snarling demon faces, with respirator grills fashioned to emit a constant growling sound that intensified as they entered combat. The World Eaters no longer operated with the disciplined structure of a loyalist Space Marine chapter. Instead, they organized themselves into warbands centered around particularly powerful champions. These warbands bore names that celebrated their violent nature: the Skull Takers, the Gore Fathers, the Brazen Flesh, the Crimson Path. Each maintained a loose internal hierarchy based solely on martial prowess, with leadership changing hands whenever a subordinate proved strong enough to challenge and defeat his superior. Commanding these disparate warbands were Angron's lieutenants, Chaos Lords who had survived the millennia through a combination of martial skill and the blessings of Khorne. Foremost among them was Kosalax the Forsworn, a hulking figure in Terminator armor whose helmet had been replaced by a demonic face plate fused directly to his skull. His right arm ended not in a hand, but in a living demonic weapon that constantly shifted form between axe, sword, and flail depending on his immediate combat needs. Alongside Kosalax stood Cargo's Bloodspitter, once an apothecary of the World Eaters, who had perverted his medical knowledge into new methods of bloodletting and pain extraction. His Narthesium had long since been modified into a tool that could drain a victim's blood while keeping them conscious, allowing him to fill the brass chalices he carried into battle with fresh vidi to offer to Khorne. The third of Angron's primary lieutenants was Leorvin Ukris, known as Fire Fist for the constantly burning power fist he wielded. Ukris had been among the first World Eaters to receive the Butcher's Nails during the Great Crusade, and 10,000 years of their influence had reduced him to little more than a vessel for rage, capable of strategic thought only in the brief periods between combat engagements. These commanders directed their forces with brutal efficiency, establishing a beachhead around the warp rift and securing landing zones for the continuing flow of troops and war machines from orbit. Within 12 hours of the initial breach, the Chaos Forces had established a perimeter extending 50 kilometers in all directions from the rift, overwhelming the scattered PDF outposts in the region through sheer violence and demonic assistance. The demonic cohorts accompanying the World Eaters were organized into formations that mirrored the Legion's own structure, but with a distinctly immaterial nature. Bloodthirsters, the greater demons of Khorne, served as field generals, each commanding a host of lesser demons. These towering entities stood 3 times the height of a space marine, their muscled bodies combining humanoid and bestial features topped with horned bull-like heads. Great leathery wings allowed them to soar above the battlefield, while their fiery whips and massive axes could cleave through tank armor with ease. Below the Bloodthirsters in the demonic hierarchy were heralds of Khorne, lesser commanders who led specific demon packs. These entities often rode juggernauts into battle, forming the equivalent of shock cavalry that could break enemy formations with devastating charges. Supporting these forces were specialized demon types, blood crushers who served as heavy assault units, flesh hounds that functioned as trackers and hunters, and swarms of bloodletters that formed the bulk of the demonic infantry. The coordination between the material World Eaters and their immaterial demonic allies was facilitated by Dark Apostles, corrupted chaplains who had once ministered to the spiritual needs of the Legion, but now served as conduits to the warp. These sinister figures conducted blood rituals on the battlefield, using the deaths of enemies and allies alike to maintain the stability of the warp rift and strengthen the connection between the demons and the material realm. What made this invasion particularly devastating was that it did not strike an unprepared world. For months before the rift opened, sleeper agents of Khorne had been active within Armageddon's population, preparing the way for the Blood God's forces. These cultists operated under the direction of the Crimson Path, a centuries-old secret society dedicated to Khorne's worship that had infiltrated multiple levels of Armageddon's society. The cult's leadership comprised individuals from surprising backgrounds, mid-level administratum officials, manufactorum overseers, and even members of the planetary nobility who had grown disillusioned with imperial rule. Their operations had been subtle at first, focusing on identifying potential recruits among the disaffected population and gradually introducing them to Khorne's bloody philosophy. The cult promised power and agency to those who felt crushed beneath the Imperium's bureaucratic weight, offering the simple clarity of Khorne's creed: blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne. As the warp storms intensified, the cult had grown bolder. They conducted secret rituals in abandoned sections of the Underhives, sacrificing kidnapped citizens to create empiric hotspots that would weaken the barrier between dimensions. They sabotaged defense systems, introduced subtle errors into PDF deployment orders, and assassinated loyal Imperial officials who might have organized effective resistance. The most devastating act of sabotage occurred 3 days before the rift opened, when cultists within Hive Volcanus's water purification system introduced a psychoactive compound into the drinking supply. This substance, derived from warp-tainted materials, didn't poison the population, but instead made them more susceptible to rage and violent impulses. By the time the rift opened, nearly 30% of Volcanus's population was experiencing heightened aggression, creating perfect conditions for mass violence. When the invasion began in earnest, these sleeper cells activated simultaneously across multiple Hive cities. In Hive Volcanus, cultists seized control of the main communication spire, broadcasting a signal that triggered latent conditioning in thousands of citizens who had unknowingly consumed tainted water. The result was immediate and catastrophic. Riots erupted throughout the Hive's middle and lower levels, with ordinary citizens turning on their neighbors with whatever weapons they could find. PDF forces responding to these disturbances found themselves fighting their own population, creating confusion and dividing Imperial defensive efforts. Meanwhile, actual cultists used the chaos as cover to seize critical infrastructure, power stations, transit hubs, and armories. By the time Governor von Strab finally acknowledged the gravity of the situation, entire sections of Hive Volcanus had fallen under cult control. The fall of Hive Volcanus occurred 7 days after the Warp Rift opened. World Eater's assault forces, supported by Khornate demons, struck the already destabilized Hive from multiple directions. They breached the outer defenses through a combination of orbital bombardment and targeted strikes at weak points identified by cultist informants. The PDF garrison, already depleted from dealing with the internal riots, could offer only token resistance against the Chaos Space Marines. The battle for Volcanus was less a military engagement and more a methodical slaughter. The World Eaters advanced level by level through the Hive, butchering everyone they encountered regardless of age, gender, or combat status. They took no prisoners and showed no mercy, for such concepts had no place in Khorne's philosophy. Blood flowed through the streets and drainage systems, pooling in the lower levels where Dark Apostles conducted elaborate rituals to channel its empiric potential back to the Warp Rift. Particularly disturbing were the ritual massacres conducted at specific locations throughout the Hive. The World Eaters established 8 ritual sites, a number sacred to Khorne, where captured civilians were systematically executed in geometrically precise arrangements. Each site focused on a different method of bloodletting, from simple beheading to elaborate flaying, creating distinct patterns of blood spatter that, when viewed from above, formed a massive 8-pointed star across the Hive's layout. These rituals served a dual purpose. First, they strengthened the Warp Rift, ensuring it remained stable enough for Angron himself to eventually cross over. Second, they began the process of corrupting Armageddon's very soil, infusing it with warp energy that would make the planet more hospitable to demonic entities. The blood that soaked into the ground didn't simply disappear, it altered the fundamental nature of the territory, creating a metaphysical claim for the blood god. By the 15th day of the invasion, Hive Volcanus had been transformed from a bustling industrial center into a charnel house. The World Eaters established it as their primary base of operations, converting the governor's palace into a temple to Khorne. The Great Manufactoria, once producing tanks and weapons for the Imperium, were repurposed to forge demonic weapons and armor, their machine spirits broken and corrupted by dark mechanicum engineers who accompanied the invasion force. From this foothold, the Khornate forces began expanding outward, launching raids against neighboring hives and PDF strongpoints. Their strategy showed more sophistication than might be expected from servants of the blood god. Rather than attacking all targets equally, They prioritized locations with strategic value, communication hubs, defense installations, and supply depots. This suggested that despite their bloodthirsty nature, the invasion's commanders maintained enough tactical acumen to conduct an effective military campaign. The PDF forces, attempting to contain the spreading invasion, established defensive lines along the ash wastes between hives. These hastily constructed fortifications, trenches, bunkers, and artillery positions were intended to slow the chaos advance and buy time for reinforcements to arrive. However, the continuing warp storms made interstellar travel nearly impossible, leaving Armageddon increasingly isolated as the bloodshed continued. As the first month of the invasion drew to a close, astropathic communications detected a new disturbance in the warp. Something massive was approaching the rift, an entity of such power that its mere proximity caused psychically sensitive individuals across Armageddon to experience seizures and bleeding from their eyes. The Dark Apostles intensified their rituals, directing their followers to collect even more blood and skulls to prepare for their master's arrival. The Daemon Primarch of Khorne, Angron, was coming to Armageddon, and the true horror of the war was about to begin. As the blood-soaked horror of Hive Volcanus's fall reverberated across Armageddon, the catastrophic failure of Governor Hermann von Straub's leadership became impossible to ignore. The planetary administration had collapsed into disarray, with contradictory orders flowing from the governor's palace in Hive Tartarus. Von Straub, refusing to acknowledge the severity of the invasion, continued to issue delusional proclamations promising swift victory, even as chaos forces secured their foothold. Into this leadership vacuum stepped an unlikely figure who would become synonymous with Armageddon's defense, Commissar Sebastian Yarrick. Prior to the invasion, Yarrick had served as the senior political officer attached to the 252nd Armageddon Steel Legion Regiment stationed in Hive Hellsreach. A veteran of numerous campaigns across the segmentum, Yarrick possessed a reputation for unflinching discipline tempered with pragmatic battlefield sense. When reports of Hive Volcanus's fall reached Hellsreach, Yarrick immediately recognized the existential threat facing the planet. Without waiting for authorization from the governor's office, he initiated emergency protocols within his jurisdiction, mobilizing PDF reserves and establishing defensive perimeters. His actions directly contravened von Straub's standing orders to maintain normal production quotas and avoid alarming the civilian population. Yarrick's decisive leadership quickly attracted the attention of other military commanders, frustrated by the governor's inaction. Colonel Matthias of the 14th Armageddon Steel Legion and General Kurov of the Planetary Defense Forces both pledged their support to Yarrick's containment strategy. Within days, a de facto command structure had formed around the Commissar, bypassing the official planetary government. The Armageddon Steel Legion, the planet's primary military force, proved crucial to organizing effective resistance. The Steel Legion's regimental structure reflected Armageddon's harsh industrial character, heavily mechanized infantry supported by substantial armor divisions, specializing in chemical warfare and urban combat. Their standard equipment included sealed carapace armor with rebreathers, necessary for survival in Armageddon's toxic atmosphere, which coincidentally provided some protection against the psychic emanations affecting unshielded troops near the warp rift. The 8th Armageddon Steel Legion, commanded by Colonel Astor, deployed to secure the vital isthmus connecting Armageddon Prime and Secundus. Their mechanized companies established a series of fortified choke points along the narrow land bridge, using Chimera transports to maintain mobile reserve forces that could respond to breakthroughs. The regiment's heavy weapons companies, equipped with Lehman Russ battle tanks and Basilisk artillery, created overlapping fields of fire covering the most likely approach vectors. The 3rd and 5th Steel Legion regiments, operating from Hive and Furnace, conducted aggressive reconnaissance in force operations against Chaos patrols, gathering critical intelligence on enemy movements while disrupting supply lines. These actions revealed that the World Eaters were establishing ritual sites at precise geometric intervals around the primary warp rift, information that would later prove vital to Imperial counterstrategies. Yarrick's growing authority received official sanction 23 days into the invasion, when an astropathic message penetrated the warp storms surrounding Armageddon. The communication, bearing the seal of Lord Solar Eugenian, formally removed Governor von Straub from command and appointed Yarrick as acting planetary governor with full emergency powers. The message also promised reinforcements with all possible haste, though the continuing warp disturbances made the timeline for their arrival uncertain. Von Straub, enraged by his dismissal, attempted to rally loyalist PDF units to maintain his position. His effort collapsed when Commissar Yarrick personally led a detachment of Steel Legion veterans into the governor's palace. The confrontation ended without bloodshed. Von Straub was placed under house arrest, confined to a secure wing of the palace, where he could neither interfere with defense operations nor be targeted by Chaos assassins seeking to exploit his incompetence. From his new headquarters in Hive Tartarus's Strategic Command Center, Yarrick implemented a comprehensive defense plan. He divided Armageddon's remaining military assets into 3 strategic groups: a containment force to slow the Chaos advance from Hive Volcanus, a mobile reserve to respond to new threats, and garrison forces to secure critical infrastructure and population centers. Civilian manufacturing was converted entirely to military production, with munitorium officers embedded in each manufactoria to ensure efficiency. Particularly innovative was Yarrick's approach to the civilian population. Rather than attempting mass evacuations, which would have overwhelmed available transport and created vulnerable refugee columns, he implemented a defense-in-depth strategy within the hives themselves. Civilians with relevant skills were conscripted into auxiliary defense forces. Former construction workers became fortification engineers, medical staff were organized into triage units, and factory workers with technical knowledge were assigned to maintain weapons and vehicles. These measures stabilized the immediate crisis, but Yarrick understood that Armageddon could not stand alone against the forces of chaos. The planet needed outside intervention, particularly against the demonic entities that conventional weapons struggled to harm permanently. His prayers for reinforcement were answered 32 days after the invasion began, when the first Imperial relief forces translated from the warp at the system's edge. The vanguard of this relief force came in the form of the Space Wolves, one of the most ancient and renowned chapters of the Adeptus Astartes. Led by their great wolf Logan Grimnar, the Space Wolves had forced a dangerous passage through the warp storms, guided by their rune priests who could sense paths through the empiric turbulence invisible to conventional navigators. Their fleet emerged battle-scarred but intact, immediately establishing a secure corridor for subsequent Imperial forces to follow. Grimnar's decision to personally lead the Armageddon relief force spoke to the gravity with which the Space Wolves viewed the situation. As chapter master, the Great Wolf rarely deployed with anything less than the most serious threats to the Imperium. His personal involvement ensured that the Space Wolves committed substantial resources, nearly 5 full companies of their battle brothers, accompanied by their unique arsenal of weapons and vehicles adapted to the harsh environment of their home world Fenris. The Space Wolves' combat doctrine contrasted sharply with the methodical approach of the Steel Legion. Where Armageddon's defenders focused on defensive positions and coordinated fire support, the Sons of Rus specialized in aggressive shock assaults and close-quarters combat. This complementary approach would prove vital in the campaigns to come, providing the Imperial defense with tactical flexibility that the single-minded World Eaters struggled to counter. Grimnar established his command post in Hive Hellsreach, deliberately positioning his forces separate from Yarrick's headquarters in Tartarus. This decision reflected both strategic prudence, avoiding a single decapitation strike against Imperial leadership, and the Space Wolves' traditional independence from Imperial command structures. Nevertheless, Grimnar and Yarrick established an effective working relationship, communicating daily via secure Vox channels to coordinate their respective forces. The Space Wolves deployed their companies according to their traditional pack structure. The Blackmans, led by the young but gifted Wolf Lord Ragnar, secured the outer perimeter of Hive Hellsreach, conducting aggressive patrols to clear Chaos cultist cells from the surrounding ash wastes. The Iron Wolves, specialists in armored warfare, positioned their land raiders and predator tanks along strategic arterial routes between hives, providing rapid response capability against World Eater's breakthrough attempts. Most significant was the deployment of the Wolf Guard, the chapter's veteran elite, directly against demonic manifestations. Equipped with sanctified weapons and ancient Terminator armor bearing runes of warding, these warriors could engage even bloodthirsters in close combat, their centuries of experience allowing them to withstand the psychological impact of facing such entities. Their presence dramatically improved Imperial morale, as guardsmen witnessed these legendary warriors charging directly into concentrations of demons that conventional forces could barely slow. The Space Wolves brought not only military might, but also specialized knowledge of dealing with warp entities. Their rune priests, psychically gifted warriors whose abilities were shaped by Fenrisian traditions rather than conventional librarius training, could detect demonic presences and disrupt the rituals sustaining the warp rift. These wolf priests established a network of runic wards around key Imperial positions, creating zones where the Materium remained strong against empiric intrusion. Following the Space Wolves' arrival came elements of 3 other Adeptus Astartes chapters. The Blood Angels sent their 3rd company under Captain Tycho, specialists in jump pack assaults who could match the World Eater's mobility. The Ultramarines contributed a demi-company of their 1st company veterans, Terminator armored elites who reinforced critical defensive positions. The Salamanders deployed a strike force focused on evacuating civilians from threatened areas, their chapter's traditional concern for human life manifesting in rescue operations that saved thousands. While the Adeptus Astartes provided crucial combat power, equally important was the arrival of the Inquisition's representatives. Inquisitor Lord Hector Rex of the Ordo Malleus, a veteran of dozens of demonic incursions, arrived with a cadre of specialists trained specifically to counter chaos manifestations. His staff included savants with extensive knowledge of cornate ritual practices, psychers trained to detect warp anomalies, and interrogators skilled at extracting information from captured cultists. Rex immediately recognized the invasion's true nature, not merely a military assault, but an attempt to transform Armageddon into a demon world, a planet wholly claimed by the warp. The ritual sites established by the World Eaters formed a complex geometric pattern that, if completed, would permanently anchor the warp rift and allow unrestricted demonic manifestation across the planet's surface. Preventing the completion of this pattern became the Inquisition's primary objective. Working from the secure inquisitorial facility, established in Hive Tartarus's deepest levels, Rex implemented containment protocols developed from centuries of Ordo Malleus experience. These included the deployment of null field generators at strategic locations to disrupt warp energies, the distribution of hexagrammic wards to military units engaging demonic entities, and the establishment of psychic screening protocols to identify potential cultist infiltrators among refugee populations. Particularly controversial was Rex's decision to implement memory protocols for civilians exposed to demonic manifestations. These protocols, ranging from hypnotherapeutic treatment to more invasive mind-wipe procedures in severe cases, were designed to prevent the spread of chaos knowledge among the general population. While Yarrick objected to the more extreme measures, he recognized the necessity of preventing mass corruption and reluctantly authorized the Inquisition's containment procedures. The Ordo Malleus brought specialized military assets to supplement conventional forces. Grey Knight strike teams, though few in number, deployed against the most powerful demonic manifestations. Operating in absolute secrecy, these silver-armored warriors appeared suddenly at critical junctures, banishing greater demons before disappearing again, their very existence unacknowledged in official reports. Sisters of Battle from the Order of the Argent Shroud established cordons around captured ritual sites, purifying the corrupted ground with sanctified promethium and constant prayer. Inquisitor Rex's most significant contribution came in the form of intelligence analysis that revealed the invasion's underlying pattern. By correlating reports from across Armageddon, his savants identified that the World Eater's seemingly random attacks actually followed specific numerological significance to Khorne targeting locations that would form an 8-pointed star of massive scale across the planet's surface. This insight allowed Imperial forces to predict future assault vectors and position defenses accordingly. The combined Imperial response stabilized the situation by the invasion's 40th day. The chaos advance from Hive Volcanus had been contained, if not reversed, and secondary warp breaches in other regions had been sealed by Grey Knight's operations. The World Eaters and their demonic allies still held significant territory, but their momentum had been broken by the coordinated defense now in place. This strategic stalemate was shattered, however, by astropathic disturbances of unprecedented magnitude detected emanating from the primary warp rift. The psychic shockwave incapacitated unshielded psychers across the planet and caused even non-psychic individuals to experience momentary disorientation. Inquisitor Rex's analysis was grim. Something of immense power was crossing between dimensions. The ritual sites established by the World Eaters had created sufficient stability in the warp rift to allow the passage of a being whose very presence distorted reality. The warp rift above Armageddon pulsed with malevolent energy on the 43rd day of the invasion, expanding to nearly triple its original diameter in a matter of hours. The polluted sky darkened as if night had fallen prematurely, while blood-red lightning arced between churning clouds. Seismic tremors shook the ground for hundreds of kilometers around the breach, causing structural damage to outlying hab blocks and toppling defensive fortifications established by the Steel Legion. Those with psychic sensitivity experienced crushing migraines and nosebleeds, while even non-psychic individuals reported a sensation of inexplicable dread and pressure behind their eyes. Through this widened tier between dimensions emerged Angron, the Daemon Primarch of Khorne. His manifestation was no subtle materialization, but a violent birth into real space that killed everything within a kilometer radius through sheer psychic backlash. The Demon Prince stood nearly 5 meters tall, his massive frame combining the worst aspects of his former transhuman physiology with demonic reconstruction. His skin had transformed into crimson scales that rippled with internal heat, while his musculature had hypertrophied to impossible proportions, straining against his flesh like creatures trying to escape confinement. Angron's face retained just enough of his original features to make his demonic transformation all the more horrifying. His once noble countenance, already marred by the butcher's nails during his mortal existence, had elongated into a bestial muzzle filled with jagged metallic teeth that constantly leaked molten brass. His eyes burned with warp fire, pupils shaped like Khorne's skull rune, and his scalp bristled with horns of varying lengths, some resembling a crown, others curved like those of a predatory beast. The butcher's nails, the neural implants that had tormented him since childhood, had evolved into a living part of his anatomy, writhing beneath his scalp like metallic worms, and periodically puncturing through his skin only to retract again. 2 vast leathery wings extended from his back, each spanning nearly 8 meters and ending in hooked talons capable of impaling a space marine. These appendages weren't merely decorative. Despite his enormous mass, they allowed him surprising aerial mobility, which he would demonstrate to devastating effect in the battles to come. His armor, if it could still be called such, had fused with his flesh over the millennia. Plates of brass and ceramite had melded with his demonic hide, forming an irregular carapace that bore the scars of 10,000 years of warfare in the warp. Skulls, some human, others belonging to Xeno species or even other demons, had been incorporated into this living armor, their eye sockets occasionally flaring with the same warp fire that burned in Angron's gaze. Most terrible of all was his weapon, the Black Blade, a massive 2-handed sword forged from warp stuff and solidified hatred. Nearly as long as the Primarch was tall, this weapon constantly dripped with blood that never dried, leaving a trail of viti that sizzled when it touched the ground. The blade could cut through tank armor as easily as flesh, and wounds inflicted by it resisted all medical treatment, continuing to bleed until the victim expired. Inquisitorial records would later note that even looking at the Black Blade for too long caused nosebleeds and vision problems among mortal troops. Accompanying Angron through the breach were 12 bloodthirsters, greater demons of Khorne, who served as his honor guard. Each stood only slightly shorter than the Primarch himself, their bull-headed forms wielding fiery whips and massive axes. They arranged themselves in a circle around their master, their wings creating a canopy of leather and scale above the blood-soaked ground. Together, they began a rhythmic chant in the dark tongue, their voices causing physical pain to all who heard it, while reality itself seemed to warp around them. The tactical impact of Angron's arrival was immediate and catastrophic. The temperature within 50 kilometers of the warp rift rose by 15 degrees as the Daemon Primarch's rage affected the local environment. Unprotected water sources boiled away, while metal surfaces became too hot to touch. Plants withered and died, and animals fled in terror, or more disturbingly, turned on each other in sudden berserker rage. PDF forces stationed at observation posts within this radius reported that their soldiers experienced uncontrollable aggression, with several units suffering friendly fire incidents before commanders ordered a full withdrawal. Astropathic communications across the entire planet became nearly impossible as the empiric disturbance caused by Angron's presence overwhelmed all but the strongest psychic signals. Sanctioned psychers in Imperial service suffered terribly. Several died from cerebral hemorrhages, while others fell into catatonic states, or worse, became conduits for lesser warp entities. The Grey Knights present on Armageddon immediately implemented psychic shielding protocols, using their collective power to establish protected zones where astropathic communication could still function, albeit unreliably. Within hours of his manifestation, Angron demonstrated that he was no mere symbolic figurehead, but an active combat leader of terrifying effectiveness. Unlike many demon princes who directed their forces from secure locations, the Red Angel led from the front, personally spearheading an assault against a Steel Legion fortified position designated Defense Line Kappa. This heavily reinforced trench network, supported by bunkers and artillery emplacements, had successfully held back World Eaters probing attacks for over a week. Under Angron's direct command, it fell in less than 3 hours. Survivors of Defense Line Kappa described how the Daemon Primarch moved across the battlefield with impossible speed, covering hundreds of meters in seconds despite his enormous size. His first assault broke through the forward trenches when he simply leaped over the defensive lines, landing in the midst of the command section and slaughtering the officers before they could coordinate a response. The Black Blade carved through Leman Russ battle tanks as if they were made of parchment, while his physical strength allowed him to tear apart bunkers with his bare hands, pulling apart rockcrete walls to reach the defenders inside. Most disturbing was the effect Angron's presence had on Imperial morale. Veteran soldiers who had held firm against Chaos Space Marines broke and fled when the Daemon Primarch approached. The psychic pressure of his rage overwhelmed even the strongest-willed humans, triggering either paralyzing fear or uncontrollable aggression, both equally fatal on the battlefield. Only those with specialized training or equipment could maintain combat effectiveness in his presence. Steel Legion officers reported that standard commissarial execution of fleeing troops proved ineffective. The terror inspired by Angron simply overwhelmed the fear of summary execution. Following the fall of Defense Line Kappa, Angron established a pattern of operations that maximized his psychological impact. Rather than concentrating on a single front, he would appear suddenly at different points along the Imperial defensive perimeter, often targeting locations where resistance was strongest. This approach served multiple purposes. It prevented Imperial forces from establishing a concentrated defense against him. It demoralized defenders by demonstrating that nowhere was truly safe, and it allowed him to personally partake in the maximum amount of bloodshed, an offering to his patron god Khorne. The Daemon Primarch's battlefield role extended beyond frontline combat. He served as a focal point for warp energy, his presence strengthening the connection between the material realm and the immaterium in whatever area he occupied. This amplification allowed lesser demons to manifest more easily and remain stable for longer periods, without requiring the elaborate summoning rituals normally needed to anchor them to real space. In practical terms, this meant that any engagement involving Angron quickly escalated as demonic reinforcements materialized to join the slaughter. Angron's tactical approach revealed that despite his rage-driven nature, he retained considerable military acumen from his days as a Legion commander. He targeted command and control assets with unerring precision, prioritized the destruction of artillery positions that could threaten his demonic allies, and systematically eliminated Adeptus Astartes' forces that posed the greatest threat to his World Eaters. His movements across the battlefield often appeared random to Imperial observers, but inquisitorial analysis later revealed complex patterns that maximized both strategic advantage and ritual significance to Khorne. The bloodthirsters accompanying Angron operated as both bodyguards and field commanders, each leading a separate demonic host against Imperial positions. These greater demons displayed distinct combat styles and preferences, suggesting individual identities despite their common allegiance to Khorne. Inquisitor Rex's savants managed to identify several based on their behavior patterns and physical characteristics, compiling a grim catalog of these entities for future reference. Skarbrand the Exiled One, perhaps the most notorious of the bloodthirsters, led frenzied frontal assaults against the heaviest Imperial fortifications, his twin-axis slaughter and carnage sundering even the thickest armor. Angrath the Unbound specialized in aerial attacks, using his superior mobility to strike at artillery positions and supply lines. Khadjeganath the Undefeated commanded packs of flesh hounds that hunted down and eliminated isolated Imperial units. Each greater demon commanded its own lesser demonic cohorts, creating a tiered command structure that allowed the Khornate forces to coordinate complex operations across multiple fronts. The lesser demons that accompanied these greater entities varied in form and function. Bloodletters formed the bulk of the demonic infantry, their crimson bodies and hellblades making them deadly opponents in close combat. They attacked in tight formations called slaughter hosts, overwhelming defenders through sheer numbers and ferocity. Flesh hounds served as trackers and flankers, using their supernatural senses to locate hidden Imperial positions and their brass collars to resist psychic countermeasures. Blood Crushers, demon-possessed juggernauts ridden by elite bloodletters, functioned as heavy cavalry, their thunderous charges breaking through defensive lines to create openings for other forces to exploit. The psychological impact of these demonic forces on Imperial defenders cannot be overstated. The human mind is not designed to process such entities, whose very existence contradicts natural law. Standard issue Imperial Guard flak armor provided no protection against hellblades, while conventional lasguns often proved ineffective against demonic flesh that could reconstitute itself after injury. Only specialized weapons, flamers, plasma guns, and sanctified ammunition showed consistent effectiveness, but these were in limited supply as the siege dragged on. Commissar Yarrick recognized early that conventional morale maintenance tactics would prove insufficient against such horrors. He implemented specialized training protocols for all Imperial forces, combining practical combat techniques against demonic entities with psychological conditioning to resist their terror effects. Ecclesiarchy priests were embedded with frontline units to provide spiritual support, leading troops in prayers and litanies that, while offering no physical protection, helped stabilize their mental state when facing the unnatural. Most effective against the demonic threat were the Adeptus Astartes, whose transhuman physiology and intensive mental conditioning made them resistant to the fear effects that debilitated ordinary humans. The Space Wolves proved particularly adept at combating demons, their chapter's long experience fighting warp entities evident in their tactics. Wolfguard Terminators armed with frost blades and storm bolters established a defensive perimeter around Hive Hellsreach, successfully repelling multiple demonic assaults led by bloodthirsters. The civilian population suffered terribly under the psychological strain of demonic invasion. Mass hysteria swept through the Hive cities as rumors of demon sightings spread. Some citizens turned to desperate worship of the Emperor, gathering in vast congregations that overwhelmed cathedral spaces. Others succumbed to darker impulses, seeing the invasion as evidence of the Emperor's abandonment and turning to chaos worship in hopes of survival. Commissariat and arbitrator forces found themselves allocating significant resources to maintaining order within supposedly secure zones, executing both chaos cultists and doomsday preachers whose messages threatened civil stability. The most disturbing development came approximately 60 days into the invasion, when Angron initiated what Imperial scholars would later term the Feast of Souls. Having established control over nearly 30% of Armageddon's surface, the Daemon Primarch ordered the construction of massive blood collection facilities in captured territories. Millions of captured civilians were systematically processed through these nightmarish factories, their blood drained into enormous brass containers inscribed with cornate runes. These containers were then transported to 8 ritual sites arranged in a perfect octagon around the primary warp rift. At each site, Dark Apostles conducted elaborate ceremonies that used the collected blood to further stabilize and expand the warp breach. The rituals followed an 8-day cycle, with each site activating in sequence to create a rotating wheel of sorcerous energy. The effect was to create a self-sustaining warp storm centered on Armageddon, one that would eventually transform the entire planet into a demon world permanently claimed by Khorne. Inquisitorial analysis indicated that if all 8 sites completed their ritual cycles, the transformation would become irreversible. This apocalyptic threat finally prompted the deployment of the Grey Knights' full strike force. Operating from their orbiting strike cruiser, Eternal Faith, the Third Brotherhood teleported directly into the ritual sites, timing their assaults to disrupt the ceremonies at their most vulnerable points. These precision strikes demonstrated why the Grey Knights were considered the Imperium's ultimate weapon against demonic threats. Each Terminator armored warrior was the equivalent of an entire squad of conventional space marines when facing warp entities, their nemesis force weapons and storm bolters loaded with sick-out ammunition, causing permanent damage to demonic forms. The battle for Armageddon had evolved from a planetary invasion into something far more significant, a struggle for the very nature of reality within the system. If Angron succeeded, the planet would become a permanent foothold for chaos in a strategically vital region of the Imperium. The Daemon Primarch's presence had transformed what might have been a conventional, if brutal, military campaign into an existential threat that demanded the Imperium's most extreme responses. As the war ground into its 3rd month, both sides prepared for a confrontation that would determine not just who controlled Armageddon, but what Armageddon would become. The sprawling industrial expanse of Hive Hellsreach became the crucible of Armageddon's defense as Commissar Yarrick established his forward command post in the Hive's administrative spire. From this vantage point, the veteran Commissar could observe the ash wastes stretching toward the distant silhouette of Hive Volcanus, now a twisted parody of Imperial architecture, with cornate symbols carved into its outer walls and great brass skull icons mounted upon its spires. The tactical situation had deteriorated rapidly since Angron's manifestation, with Chaos forces pushing outward from their stronghold in increasingly coordinated assaults. Yarrick's defensive strategy for Hellsreach demonstrated his pragmatic approach to urban warfare. Rather than attempting to hold the entire Hive, an impossible task given available manpower, he implemented a layered defense that sacrificed the outermost habitation rings to buy time and channel enemy forces into prepared killing zones. The Hive's natural structure facilitated this approach, with its concentric design of manufacturing districts surrounding the central administrative and aristocratic quarters. Hellsreach will not fall while a single defender draws breath, Yarrick declared in his initial briefing to the Steel Legion officers. This was not mere rhetoric but practical doctrine. Every Steel Legion trooper received specific instructions on their responsibilities during each phase of the defense, with clear fallback positions and contingency protocols. Squads were assigned specific sectors with overlapping fields of fire, while specialized demolition teams prepared key structures for controlled collapse to block main thoroughfares when necessary. The 121st and 143rd Armageddon Steel Legion regiments formed the backbone of Hellsreach's defense. These veteran formations had fought across numerous war zones in the sector, their experience in toxic environments and urban combat proving invaluable. Steel Legion troops wore distinctive greatcoats and respirator masks designed for Armageddon's polluted atmosphere, equipment that coincidentally provided limited protection against the blood mist that preceded cornate assaults. Their standard armament of lasguns was supplemented with flamers and grenade launchers, weapons particularly effective in the confined spaces of urban warfare. Colonel Starn of the 121st positioned his regiment's heavy weapons teams at strategic choke points throughout the hive's middle levels. Autocannon emplacements covered major transit arteries, while mortar teams established firing positions on elevated platforms that provided coverage of likely assembly areas for enemy forces. The regiment's Chimera transports were modified for urban operations, with additional armor plating welded to their sides and front glacis plates to withstand the close-range attacks favored by World Eater's berserkers. The 143rd, under Major Disrick, implemented an innovative mobile defense strategy utilizing the hive's internal transit system. Platoon-sized hunter-killer teams mounted on Toro's rapid assault vehicles patrolled the outer hab zones, engaging chaos infiltrators and cultist cells before they could establish footholds. These patrols maintained constant Vox communication with command, creating a real-time intelligence network that allowed Yarrick to track enemy movements and redirect reinforcements to threatened sectors. Augmenting these regular forces were the Hellsreach militia, civilians with military experience hastily organized into auxiliary units. While lacking the training and equipment of the Steel Legion, these local defenders possessed intimate knowledge of the hive's layout, including maintenance tunnels, service ducts, and unofficial passages not marked on standard maps. This knowledge proved invaluable for establishing ambush points and escape routes that confounded even the enhanced senses of Chaos Space Marines. The civilian evacuation presented one of Yarrick's greatest challenges. Hellsreach contained over 18 million inhabitants spread across hundreds of square kilometers of urban sprawl. Complete evacuation was logistically impossible, especially with Chaos forces controlling much of the surrounding territory. Instead, Yarrick implemented a priority system that focused on relocating civilians from the outer hab zones to designated shelter zones in the hive's core. The Administratum census data provided the framework for this operation, with evacuation priority assigned based on specialized skills and vulnerability. Medical personnel, technical experts, and those with military experience received highest priority, followed by children and their guardians. The harsh reality of limited resources meant that many citizens in the outermost zones received only basic supplies and instructions for reaching emergency gathering points if their sectors came under direct attack. Ecclesiarchy priests played a crucial role in maintaining order during the evacuation. Cardinal Athios organized his clergy into crisis teams that accompanied Steel Legion escorts, their presence calming panicked civilians and preventing the mass hysteria that had hampered similar operations in other hives. The priests also performed a secondary screening function, watching for signs of chaos corruption among the refugees and discreetly marking suspicious individuals for later arbitrator investigation. The physical defense of Hellsreach centered on 3 concentric perimeters, each designed to bleed the enemy of momentum while preserving defender manpower. The outermost perimeter, designated Ferris Line, utilized the existing hab block architecture with minimal modifications, barricades at street intersections, sniper positions in abandoned manufactoria, and pre-sighted artillery coordinates for rapid-fire missions. Steel Legion forces maintained only a token presence here, primarily observation teams that would withdraw once enemy forces committed to their attack vectors. The second defensive ring, Adamant Line, represented a more substantial investment of resources. Here, combat engineers had transformed the urban landscape into a deliberate killing ground. Residential blocks were selectively demolished to create fields of rubble that channeled enemy movements into prepared fire lanes. Prometheum pipelines were rerouted to create improvised flame traps that could be triggered remotely. Medikey facilities were established in reinforced basement levels, with multiple access routes allowing casualties to be evacuated without exposing medical personnel to direct fire. The innermost defensive position, Emperor's Rampart, protected the hive's central administrative, power generation, and water purification facilities. This final line featured the heaviest concentration of troops and equipment, including the majority of the Steel Legion's armored units. Leman Russ battle tanks, their turrets removed to fit through the hive's internal thoroughfares, were positioned in reinforced emplacements that maximized their fields of fire while minimizing their vulnerability to close assault. Hydra flak tanks, originally intended for anti-aircraft operations, were repurposed as anti-infantry platforms, their quad autocannons devastating against concentrated infantry attacks. The battle for Hellsreach began in earnest on the 65th day of the invasion, when Chaos Auspex returns detected massive energy signatures approaching from the direction of Hive Volcanus. Reconnaissance flights identified a World Eater's assault force, comprising approximately 300 Chaos Space Marines supported by demonic entities and corrupted armor. Most concerning was the presence of a bloodthirster, identified as Skarbrand leading the vanguard, suggesting that Angron considered Hellsreach a priority target worth committing one of his principal lieutenants. The initial assault struck the southeastern quadrant of the Hive, where the primary Manufactoria district offered wide avenues suitable for armored advance. World Eater's Rhino transports and land raiders moved in tight formation, their hulls adorned with spikes upon which were impaled the bodies of civilians from fallen hives. Behind this armored spearhead came hundreds of cultists driving improvised war vehicles, civilian cargo haulers modified with welded armor plates and mounted weapons, their engines enhanced through unholy rituals that pushed them beyond normal operational parameters. Colonel Starn's defensive plan for this sector demonstrated the Steel Legion's expertise in urban combat. Rather than engaging the Chaos armor directly, his forces allowed the enemy's lead elements to penetrate 2 kilometers into the Hive before initiating their response. Demolition charges collapsed key buildings along the main thoroughfare, trapping the Chaos convoy in a canyon of rubble. Simultaneously, hidden heavy weapons teams opened fire from elevated positions, targeting the trapped vehicle's tracks and weapon systems, rather than attempting to penetrate their front armor. As the World Eaters disembarked from their immobilized transports, they encountered the next phase of the defensive plan. The entire Manufactoria district had been rigged with a network of promethium distribution pipes connected to the Hive's main fuel reserves. On Starn's command, these pipes were ruptured and ignited, transforming 20 square blocks into an inferno that reached temperatures high enough to damage even ceramite power armor. Those World Eaters who survived the conflagration emerged to find themselves in pre-sighted killing zones, where waiting Steel Legion heavy weapons teams cut them down with concentrated fire. This initial victory proved short-lived when Skarbrand entered the battle. The Bloodthirster's arrival was heralded by a psychic shockwave that caused nosebleeds and momentary disorientation among all Imperial forces within a kilometer radius. Standing nearly twice the height of a Space Marine dreadnought, the Greater Demon's very presence caused nearby ferrocrete to crack and metal to corrode. His twin axes, Slaughter and Carnage, glowed with unnatural heat as he carved a path through the Imperial defensive positions, each swing claiming multiple lives. Against such an entity, conventional tactics proved ineffective. Lascannon shots that would have crippled a battle tank merely caused superficial damage to Skarbrand's demonic form, while the psychological impact of his rage aura sent entire squads into either catatonic shock or berserk frenzy. Colonel Starn recognized the existential threat and ordered an immediate fighting withdrawal to the second defensive line, sacrificing territory to preserve his forces for later counterattacks. The southeastern quadrant fell within hours, but the cost to the Chaos forces had been substantial. Nearly 40% of their armored vehicles lay abandoned in the ruins, while dozens of World Eaters had been immolated in the Promethium fires or isolated and eliminated by Steel Legion hunter-killer teams. More importantly, the defensive action had revealed the enemy's primary thrust line, allowing Yarrick to reposition reserves accordingly. As the battle for Hellsreach intensified, the conflict separated into distinct operational theaters, each with its own character and challenges. The northeastern residential district saw house-to-house fighting between Steel Legion infantry and Cornate cultists, with control of individual hab blocks changing hands multiple times in a single day. The western industrial zone became a battleground of ambushes and counter-ambushes, with both sides utilizing the labyrinthine layout of Manufactoria and storage facilities for cover and concealment. Most critical was the central water reclamation complex that processed and purified the hive's drinking supply. Recognizing its strategic value, a World Eaters warband led by the champion Castellax launched a direct assault on the facility on the third day of the battle. The complex's defense fell to Captain Atreus and his second company veterans, who had established a fortified perimeter around the main purification towers. Atreus's defense of the water complex exemplified the Steel Legion's methodical approach to urban warfare. Rather than attempting to hold the facility's extensive outer perimeter, he concentrated his forces around the critical machinery, creating a dense defensive position ringed with heavy weapons. Approaching World Eaters first encountered minefields laid in carefully calculated patterns, forcing them to either slow their advance or suffer casualties from anti-personnel explosives designed to damage leg joints and lower armor plates. Those who navigated the minefields then faced interlocking fields of heavy bolter fire from concealed emplacements. Atreus had positioned his weapons teams on elevated gantries that offered superior firing angles while remaining difficult to target from ground level. Supporting these teams were sniper specialists equipped with long-laws rifles, who targeted exposed head sections and weapon joints with precision shots. The World Eaters responded with typical brutality, using their own cultist forces as human shields to absorb the defensive fire while their Astartes elements closed to assault range. Once in close combat, the corrupted Space Marine strength and ferocity gave them a decisive advantage over the Steel Legion troops. Captain Atreus, recognizing the changing tactical situation, ordered a fighting withdrawal into the facility's interior, where the confined spaces would limit the number of enemies that could engage simultaneously. The battle for the water reclamation complex lasted 27 hours of continuous combat. The facility's interior became a charnel house as World Eaters berserkers pursued Steel Legion squads through maintenance tunnels and filtration chambers. Atreus's forces utilized their superior knowledge of the layout to set ambushes and traps, including flooding sections with superheated steam from ruptured purification pipes and sealing bulkhead doors to isolate and eliminate Chaos forces piecemeal. The turning point came when Castellax himself led a final push toward the central control chamber. The World Eater's champion, his Terminator armor adorned with flayed skin and brass skull totems, tore through the remaining defenders with his demon-possessed power axe. Captain Atreus, already wounded from earlier engagements, faced the Chaos champion in single combat to buy time for his technical specialists to complete their work. The duel between Atreus and Castellax was brief and brutal. The Steel Legion officer managed to wound the World Eater with a well-placed melt-a-bomb that partially melted the left side of his Terminator plate, but Castellax's unholy strength proved overwhelming. As Atreus fell, however, his sacrifice achieved its purpose. The technical team had finished implementing Yarrick's contingency protocol. The entire water purification system initiated an emergency shutdown sequence, flooding the complex with purification chemicals that would render it unusable to the Chaos forces, while simultaneously denying them the propaganda victory of contaminating the hive's water supply. The loss of the water reclamation complex necessitated immediate adaptation of the civilian support strategy. Yarrick ordered the activation of emergency water reserves stored throughout the hive's middle levels, while Mechanicus tech priests began constructing smaller, distributed purification units that could process moisture collected from the hive's atmospheric systems. These measures could not fully replace the main facility's output, but they provided sufficient clean water to prevent immediate crisis while demonstrating to the civilian population that the Imperial authorities maintained control of essential services. As the battle for Hellsreach approached its second week, the pattern of Chaos attacks revealed a methodical strategy at odds with Khorne's usual preference for frontal assaults. World Eater's forces targeted power distribution nodes, communication relays, and food storage facilities in sequence, suggesting a deliberate attempt to degrade the hive's infrastructure rather than simply maximize casualties. This approach indicated higher strategic direction, likely from Angron himself, aimed at forcing a complete evacuation that would leave the hive's industrial capacity intact for later exploitation. Yarrick countered this strategy by implementing a defense-in-depth approach to critical infrastructure. Rather than concentrating forces around obvious targets, he distributed his reserves in concealed positions throughout the hive's middle levels, creating a rapid response network that could reinforce any threatened location within 20 minutes. This approach prevented the World Eaters from achieving the quick victories necessary for their infrastructure degradation strategy, forcing them into prolonged engagements that favored the defenders' superior knowledge of the terrain. The most dramatic example of this defensive approach occurred at Power Distribution Hub Epsilon, which supplied electricity to the hive's eastern quadrant. When Auspec's returns indicated a chaos force approaching the facility, the Steel Legion defenders appeared to withdraw, leaving only token resistance. The World Eaters, led by the champion Liorvine Ukris, secured the hub with minimal effort, believing they had achieved a significant victory. Great Wolf Logan Grimnar stood upon the command deck of the strike cruiser Fist of Russ, his massive Terminator-clad form silhouetted against the tactical hololith displaying Armageddon's war-torn surface. The ancient space wolf's face, weathered by thousands of years of warfare, remained impassive as he studied the movements of Khornate forces across the planet. His legendary frost axe, Morkai, hung at his side, the runes etched into its blade glowing with a cold blue light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. The blood god's servants move with purpose, Grimnar observed to his assembled wolf lords. They seek not merely slaughter, but conquest. Angron remembers his role as a general, not just a butcher. Grimnar's battle strategy for the Space Wolves' intervention on Armageddon reflected his millennia of experience fighting the forces of chaos. Unlike the methodical defense-in-depth approach favored by Commissar Yarrick, the Great Wolf implemented a hunting strategy that leveraged the Space Wolves' natural aggression and mobility. He divided his forces into traditional Great Company formations, each assigned to a specific operational theater with broad strategic objectives rather than rigid tactical directives. The Blackmans under Wolf Lord Ragnar spearheaded the effort to secure the southern approaches to Hive Hellsreach. Ragnar's warriors, many still young by Space Marine standards, specialized in lightning strikes against enemy supply lines and forward positions. Their assault pattern resembled the hunting techniques of actual wolves, swift attacks against vulnerable targets followed by tactical withdrawals before enemy reinforcements could respond. This approach proved particularly effective against the World Eaters, whose berserker rage often led them to overextend themselves in pursuit, separating from supporting units and becoming vulnerable to counter ambushes. Ragnar personally led an assault pack equipped with jump packs, striking deep behind enemy lines to eliminate Chaos commanders and disrupt ritual sites. His legendary Frost Blade, Frostfang, proved devastatingly effective against demonic entities, its ancient enchantments causing warp-spawned flesh to freeze and shatter upon contact. In one particularly daring raid, Ragnar and 20 of his blood claws descended upon a Khornate ritual site where dark apostles were preparing a blood sacrifice of captured Steel Legion troops. The Space Wolves struck with such speed that the ritual conductors were dead before they could even raise the alarm, their blood spilling across profane symbols meant to receive that of their victims. The Iron Wolves under Wolf Lord Orvin Heifel deployed their considerable armored strength along the Hellsreach Infernus transit corridor, utilizing land raiders and predator tanks modified with additional storm bolters and hunter-killer missiles. Heifel's armored columns operated in hunter-killer groups of 3 to 5 vehicles, using the Ash Waste's natural terrain features for concealment before emerging to strike at Chaos armor with devastating crossfire. The Iron Wolves' tank commanders displayed a mastery of armored warfare that belied the Space Wolves' reputation for close-quarters bloodlust, executing complex maneuvers that repeatedly outflanked the more straightforward World Eaters' assault patterns. Wolf Lord Crom Dragongaze led the Drakeslayers in the defense of Hive Tartarus's outer districts, where his warriors' expertise in combating monstrous opponents proved invaluable against the demon engines deployed by the World Eaters. Crom's personal combat record included the destruction of 3 cornate Mauler fiends, his rune axe cleaving through their corrupted mechanics with contemptuous ease. The Drakeslayers established a perimeter of fortified strongpoints around the Hive's main access points, each position anchored by long Fang heavy weapons teams whose combined firepower could bring down even the largest demonic constructs. Most crucial to Grimnar's strategy was the deployment of his Wolf Guard, the chapter's veteran elite, as rapid response units positioned to counter Angron himself. These warriors, each selected for their exceptional skill and experience in facing demonic entities, were equipped with the chapter's finest weapons and armor. Many wore Terminator plate inscribed with protective runes by the rune priests, while others utilized specialized equipment like thunder hammers and storm shields, particularly effective against demonic opponents. The Wolf Guard established their command post in the ruins of Cathedral Imperialis in Hive Hellsreach's central district, converting the still consecrated ground into a fortress from which they could respond to Angron's appearances anywhere in the surrounding territory. Iron Priests modified the cathedral's remaining Vox arrays to create a communication network that bypassed conventional channels, allowing Wolf Guard strike teams to coordinate their movements without risk of chaos interception. The Space Wolves' combat doctrine against demonic entities reflected their chapter's unique approach to the warp and its denizens. Unlike other chapters who relied heavily on librarians for psychic countermeasures, the Sons of Rust deployed their rune priests, whose powers drew from what they termed the world spirit rather than directly from the warp. This distinction, while considered theological hair-splitting by some imperial authorities, resulted in practical differences in how these psychers operated against demonic threats. Enjal Stormcaller, the Space Wolves' most powerful rune priest, established a network of runic wards throughout Hive Hellsreach, each carved stone inscribed with ancient Fenrisian symbols that disrupted the connection between demons and their warp source. These wards didn't prevent demonic manifestation entirely, but they weakened such entities within their sphere of influence, making them more vulnerable to conventional weapons. Particularly effective were the Chains of Morkai, interconnected runic arrays that, when activated, could temporarily bind a demon in place, preventing both movement and warp translation. Against the Bloodthirsters serving as Angron's lieutenants, the Space Wolves deployed specialized hunter-killer teams, combining Wolf Guard veterans with rune priest support. These teams utilized a tactical approach refined through millennia of fighting chaos. Long fangs with heavy weapons would target the demon's wings to limit its mobility, while Wolf Guard with storm shields formed a defensive line to absorb its initial charge. Once the demon was engaged, a rune priest would activate runic weapons designed to disrupt its connection to the warp, weakening it sufficiently for the Wolf Guard to deliver killing blows with thunder hammers and frost weapons. The effectiveness of this approach was demonstrated when Wolf Guard Terminator Squad Kajarvik encountered the Bloodthirster Kajaganath near the southern water treatment facilities. The demon's initial charge killed 3 Terminators despite their formidable armor, but the survivors formed a shield wall that absorbed its subsequent attacks long enough for Rune Priest Haldor to complete a binding ritual. With the Bloodthirster momentarily immobilized, the remaining Wolf Guard struck with coordinated precision, their thunder hammers shattering its brass armor and disrupting its physical form enough to banish it back to the warp. Against the World Eaters themselves, the Space Wolves employed tactics that exploited the Cornate Berserkers' predictable aggression. Bloodclaws, the youngest and most aggressive Space Wolves, would engage the enemy's attention with provocative attacks before withdrawing, leading pursuing World Eaters into carefully prepared ambush zones where Grey Hunters waited in concealed positions. This approach neutralized the World Eaters' advantage in close combat by allowing the Space Wolves to engage on their own terms, using concentrated bolter fire to weaken the enemy before counter-charging with frost blades and chain weapons. The Space Wolves' most significant contribution to the defense of Armageddon came not through direct combat, but through their expertise in hunting. Wolf Scouts infiltrated deep into chaos-held territory, their centuries of experience allowing them to move undetected even among the heightened senses of Chaos Space Marines. These reconnaissance operations provided invaluable intelligence on enemy movements and, more importantly, identified the pattern of ritual sites being established to strengthen Angron's connection to the material realm. Wolf Scout Pack Hradir discovered that the ritual sites formed a precise geometric pattern corresponding to an ancient cornate symbol of summoning. Each site featured 8 blood collection basins positioned around a central altar, with channels arranged to direct the flow into runes carved into the ground. The completed network would create a permanent anchor for Angron's physical manifestation, allowing him to remain in the material realm indefinitely without the usual limitations affecting demon princes. Armed with this intelligence, Logan Grimnar developed a counter-ritual strategy in consultation with rune priest Engil Stormcaller. Rather than attempting to destroy all ritual sites simultaneously, an impossible task given their number and the enemy forces protecting them, the Space Wolves would target specific nodes in the pattern to disrupt its symbolic significance. By destroying 3 key sites and replacing their cornate iconography with runes of warding, they could corrupt the entire ritual network, potentially weakening Angron's connection to the material realm. The execution of this strategy fell to the Wolfguard Terminators of Grimnar's personal guard. Teleporting directly into the targeted ritual sites, these elite warriors faced overwhelming opposition from World Eater's defenders and demonic guardians. The fighting was brutal and losses heavy, but the Space Wolves' determination proved equal to the task. At each location, once the defenders were eliminated, rune priests performed counter-rituals using the blood of the fallen, both enemy and ally, to invert the site's empiric polarity. The disruption of the ritual network had immediate and visible effects. The warp rift above Armageddon pulsed erratically, its edges fluctuating as the carefully constructed pattern of energy flows became destabilized. Angron himself, engaged in combat against Imperial forces near Hive Infernus, roared in rage as he felt his connection to the material realm weaken. The Daemon Primarch was forced to withdraw from the front lines to one of the remaining ritual sites, where his presence could stabilize the degrading network through sheer force of will. This temporary victory came at considerable cost to the Space Wolves. Of the 30 Wolfguard Terminators who participated in the ritual site assaults, only 11 returned. Among the fallen was Olaf Silvermane, one of Grimnar's oldest companions and bearer of the sacred banner of Rusvik. His last stand against a bloodthirster guardian allowed his battle brothers to complete their mission, his ancient power fist claiming one of the greater demon's eyes before he was torn apart by its hellblades. The tensions between the Space Wolves and other Imperial organizations became increasingly apparent as the campaign progressed. Commissar Yarrick, while respectful of the Adeptus Astartes' combat prowess, expressed frustration at their independent operational approach, which often bypassed the established command structure. Particularly contentious was Grimnar's refusal to commit his forces to static defensive positions, preferring instead to maintain mobile hunter-killer groups that could strike targets of opportunity. This disagreement came to a head during the defense of Hive Infernus's primary generatorium. Yarrick's battle plan called for all available forces, including Space Wolf elements, to form a defensive perimeter around this critical infrastructure. Grimnar, however, saw greater strategic value in launching a simultaneous strike against a nearby Chaos ritual site. Rather than dividing his forces, the Great Wolf committed all available Space Wolves to the offensive operation, leaving the Generatorium's defense entirely to Steel Legion units. The resulting confrontation between Yarrick and Grimnar exemplified the fundamental differences in their approaches to warfare. The Commissar, representing the Imperial Guard's doctrine of holding ground at all costs, viewed the Space Wolves' decision as a dangerous abandonment of defensive responsibilities. Grimnar, embodying the Adeptus Astartes perspective that offense often constitutes the best defense, maintained that neutralizing the ritual site would draw Chaos forces away from the Generatorium more effectively than simply awaiting their attack. The situation was further complicated by the arrival of Inquisitor Rex, whose authority technically superseded both military commanders. Rex initially supported Yarrick's position, citing the strategic importance of the Generatorium to the Hive's continued resistance. However, when Rune Priest Engel Stormcaller presented evidence that the targeted ritual site was preparing a summoning that would bring 3 additional bloodthirsters into the conflict, the Inquisitor reluctantly acknowledged the validity of Grimnar's approach. The outcome validated the Space Wolves' strategy. While the Generatorium came under heavy attack from World Eater's forces, the Steel Legion defenders held long enough for the Space Wolves to complete their operation against the ritual site. The destruction of the summoning circle not only prevented the arrival of additional greater demons, but also created such psychic backlash that many of the attacking Chaos forces were temporarily disoriented, allowing the defenders to launch a successful counterattack that secured the Generatorium's perimeter. Despite this tactical victory, the incident established a pattern of uneasy cooperation between the Space Wolves and other Imperial forces that would characterize the remainder of the campaign. Grimnar maintained operational independence while acknowledging the broader strategic framework established by Yarrick and the Inquisition. This arrangement, while not ideal from an organizational perspective, leveraged the unique strengths of each faction while minimizing conflicts over command authority. Among the individual Space Wolf heroes, whose contributions proved decisive to key battles, none stood taller than Bjorn the Fell-Handed. The ancient Dreadnought, oldest living space marine in the Imperium and last to have seen Leman Russ in person, emerged from stasis at Grimnar's request specifically to face the threat posed by Angron. Despite his age and the limitations of his Dreadnought chassis, Bjorn's tactical acumen remained undiminished, as did his hatred for the traitor legions who had turned against the Emperor during the Horus Heresy. Bjorn's greatest moment came during the Battle of Mannheim's Ridge, where World Eater's forces had established a forward base to stage attacks against Hive Hellsreach's northern approach. Leading a strike force of Wolf Guard and Long Fangs, the venerable Dreadnought executed a pincer movement that caught the Chaos forces between concentrated heavy weapons fire and his own devastating assault. His plasma cannon and Dreadnought close combat weapon, itself older than most Space Marine chapters, claimed dozens of World Eaters, including the champion Cargo's Bloodspitter, whose corrupted Narthesium Bjorn crushed along with the arm wielding it. The skies above Armageddon darkened as the campaign entered its 4th month, unnatural storm clouds swirling in patterns that defied meteorological explanation. Blood-tinged rain fell across the northern continent, leaving rusty stains on Imperial armor and equipment that required daily cleansing rituals to prevent corrosion. The psychic pressure of Angron's presence had become a constant burden on all Imperial forces, manifesting as persistent headaches among non-psychic personnel and more severe symptoms in those with even latent sensitivity. Medical officers reported increased cases of nosebleeds, insomnia, and unexplained aggression throughout the Steel Legion ranks. Logan Grimnar stood at the edge of Hellsreach's northern defensive perimeter, his massive Terminator armor silhouetted against the burning refineries beyond. The Great Wolf had received reports from his Wolf Scouts that indicated a substantial concentration of World Eater's forces gathering in the ash wastes between Hive Hellsreach and the primary warp rift. Angron was consolidating his strength for a decisive push against the Imperial stronghold, bringing together his scattered warbands into a cohesive assault force. Grimnar's tactical assessment confirmed what the Rune Priests had already divined through their rituals. Angron's connection to the material realm was weakening following the Space Wolves' disruption of the ritual network. The Daemon Primarch needed a massive influx of blood and skulls to stabilize his manifestation, and Hive Hellsreach represented the largest concentration of potential sacrifices remaining on Armageddon's northern continent. The Great Wolf's counter-strategy leveraged this understanding of the enemy's desperation. Rather than reinforcing all sectors equally, Grimnar concentrated his most experienced warriors along the projected path of Angron's personal advance. Wolfguard Terminators established fortified positions at key intersections, their ancient tactical sense allowing them to identify the most likely approach vectors. Long Fangs set up interlocking fields of fire covering these positions, their heavy weapons loaded with specialized ammunition blessed by the chapter's Iron Priests. Commissar Yarrick, recognizing the Space Wolves' expertise in combating demonic entities, integrated their deployment into his broader defensive framework. Steel Legion forces would engage the conventional chaos elements, cultists, corrupted vehicles, and even the World Eaters themselves, while the Sons of Rus focused their efforts on Angron and his demonic lieutenants. This division of labor played to the strengths of each force, allowing the human defenders to avoid direct confrontation with entities that could shatter their morale through mere proximity. The Imperial defense received unexpected reinforcement 3 days before Angron's anticipated assault, when a strike cruiser bearing the heraldry of the Grey Knights chapter translated into real space at the edge of the Armageddon system. The vessel, identified as the Purifier's Flame, had navigated the warp storms through means unknown to even the Space Wolves navigators, arriving with battle damage that suggested a harrowing journey through the Imperium. From the strike cruiser came 3 squads of Grey Knights Terminators led by Brother Captain Joros, a veteran of countless campaigns against demonic incursions across the segmentum. Joros immediately requested a secure meeting with Inquisitor Rex, Commissar Yarrick, and Logan Grimnar, during which he revealed the true purpose of his mission. The Grey Knights had developed a banishment ritual specifically calibrated to Angron's warp signature, capable of severing the Daemon Primarch's connection to the material realm, regardless of the blood sacrifices sustaining him. The ritual required 3 key components: a physical location where the barrier between real space and the warp was already thin, a force capable of engaging Angron directly to hold him in position for the ritual's duration, and a circle of 12 psychically attuned warriors to channel the necessary energies. The first requirement could be met at any of several locations where previous demonic manifestations had weakened reality's fabric. The second demanded the combined might of the Space Wolves and whatever other combat assets could be spared. The third would be provided by the Grey Knights themselves, with Brother Captain Joros serving as the ritual's focus. Grimnar received this information with characteristic pragmatism. While relations between the Space Wolves and the Inquisition had been strained by past conflicts, the Great Wolf recognized the existential threat Angron represented not just to Armageddon, but to the surrounding sectors. Setting aside historical grudges, he committed his chapter to supporting the Grey Knights' ritual, offering the Wolf Guard as the anchoring force to engage and hold the Daemon Primarch. The coordination between these disparate Imperial elements represented a logistical challenge of immense complexity. The Grey Knights operated with protocols that required minimal contact with conventional forces to maintain their secrecy, while the Space Wolves' independent command structure resisted integration into standardized Imperial battle plans. Commissar Yarrick, drawing on decades of experience managing inter-organizational conflicts, established a compartmentalized command system that allowed each force to operate according to its own doctrines while maintaining strategic coherence. Inquisitor Rex contributed his expertise in demonic lore, identifying a location that would maximize the ritual's effectiveness: the ruins of Hive Vulcanus's primary forge complex, where the initial warp breach had left a persistent thinning of the veil between dimensions. The site's proximity to Angron's projected advance path meant that luring the Daemon Primarch there would require minimal deviation from his intended target, reducing the chance that he would detect the trap being laid. The plan to draw Angron to the designated location relied on a sophisticated understanding of the Blood God's psychology. Khorne's servants were driven by martial pride as much as bloodlust. They sought not just slaughter, but worthy opponents whose skulls would honor their deity. Grimnar proposed a challenge that the Daemon Primarch could not ignore: a formal declaration of personal combat from the Great Wolf himself, broadcast on frequencies known to be monitored by World Eaters' communication systems. The message was crafted with deliberate provocations that would resonate with Angron's fractured psyche. Grimnar invoked the Primarch's failures during the Horus Heresy, his subordination to Horus rather than independent conquest, and his inability to overcome the Emperor's forces on Terra. These historical wounds, still raw despite the passage of 10 millennia, would inflame Angron's perpetual rage beyond his already tenuous control, compelling him to seek out Grimnar personally rather than delegating the Space Wolf's death to his lieutenants. As predicted, the response came swiftly, a psychic shockwave of such intensity that unprotected psychers throughout Hellsreach suffered seizures. The message contained no words, merely an overwhelming impression of rage and a compulsion drawing attention to the Forge complex. Rune priests interpreting the phenomenon confirmed what tactical logic already suggested. Angron had taken the bait. The Imperial forces moved into position with practiced efficiency. The Grey Knights established their ritual circle within the Forge complex's central foundry, where the remnants of massive smelting equipment provided natural cover, while the residual heat masked their thermal signatures from Chaos Auspec's sweeps. Each of the 12 Terminators positioned himself at a precise point around the chamber, driving force halberds into the ground to create anchoring points for the ritual energies. The Space Wolves deployed in concentric rings around this central location. Wolfguard Terminators formed the innermost defensive line, their ancient tactical dreadnought armor reinforced with additional runic wards inscribed by the chapter's most skilled rune priests. Supporting them were Grey Hunters in squads of 10, positioned to counter any World Eaters who might accompany their Primarch. The outer perimeter was secured by Long Fangs, whose heavy weapons covered all approach vectors, while Wolf Scouts maintained a network of observation posts to provide early warning of the enemy's advance. Steel Legion forces under Commissar Yarrick's direct command established a secondary defensive line 2 kilometers from the Forge complex. Their role was not to engage Angron directly, but to intercept the World Eaters and cultist forces that would inevitably follow in his wake, preventing them from interfering with the ritual. Yarrick positioned his armor assets, Leman Russ battle tanks and Chimera transports, behind prepared earthworks, creating firing positions that maximized their weapons' effectiveness while minimizing their vulnerability to close assault. The waiting proved more challenging than the preparation. For 18 hours, Imperial forces maintained combat readiness as Auspex returns tracked the gathering Chaos forces. The World Eaters moved with uncharacteristic patience, assembling their strength methodically rather than rushing headlong toward the Imperial position. This restraint, so at odds with Khorne's usual doctrine, suggested that Angron retained enough strategic acumen to recognize the possibility of a trap despite his overwhelming rage. The attack, when it finally came, began not with the anticipated frontal assault, but with a series of warp-translated insertions at unexpected points around the Imperial perimeter. Bloodletters materialized in squads of 8, their sudden appearance catching several Long Fang positions off guard. These initial skirmishes, while relatively minor, served their purpose in drawing attention and resources away from the main approach vector, which remained ominously quiet. The true assault arrived with apocalyptic force as the ground between the Imperial position and Hive Volcanus split open along a jagged line stretching nearly a kilometer. From this wound in reality emerged Angron, his massive form radiating such malevolence that nearby ferrocrete cracked and metal surfaces began to corrode. The Daemon Primarch stood at the head of his elite guard, 12 World Eaters in Terminator armor, their once white ceramite now stained crimson with dried blood, brass skull icons mounted on their pauldrons, and helmets reshaped into demonic visages. Angron's appearance had altered since his initial manifestation, his demonic form adapting to the material realm's constraints. His wings had grown larger and more bat-like, stretching nearly 10 meters from tip to tip, while his skin had hardened into overlapping scales that resembled blood-colored armor plates. The butcher's nails, once mere implants, had evolved into a living crown of writhing metal tendrils that periodically punctured his skull before retracting, each cycle corresponding to pulses of increased rage that radiated outward as tangible psychic pressure. The Daemon Primarch's advance toward the Forge complex demonstrated his tactical awareness despite his consuming rage. Rather than charging directly at the Imperial position, he utilized the terrain features of the ash wastes for partial cover, moving from one collapsed structure to another, while his Terminator guard provided suppressing fire with combi bolters. This measured approach allowed him to close half the distance to the Imperial lines before Long Fang heavy weapons opened fire, their salvo of missile and las cannon shots illuminating the pre-dawn darkness. Most of the ordnance detonated harmlessly against psychic barriers that shimmered into visibility upon impact, but several penetrated these defenses to strike Angron directly. The wounds these weapons inflicted sealed almost immediately, demonic flesh knitting together with unnatural speed, but they served their purpose in enraging the Daemon Primarch beyond his already tenuous control. With a roar that shattered remaining windows throughout the forge complex, Angron abandoned his measured advance for a direct charge, his massive wings propelling him forward with shocking speed. Logan Grimnar met this charge at the perimeter of the Wolf Guard position, Morkai raised in challenge. The Great Wolf's Terminator armor, ancient even by Space Marine standards, bore the accumulated protective runes and blessings of thousands of years of warfare against the Imperium's enemies. As Angron descended upon him, Grimnar activated these wards, creating a momentary flare of blue energy that forced the Daemon Primarch to check his charge or risk repulsion. The duel that followed defied conventional understanding of combat. Angron's black blade moved with impossible speed despite its massive size, each swing creating distortions in the air through which could be glimpsed momentary visions of the warp beyond. Grimnar countered with the practiced precision of a warrior who had faced countless enemies over millennia of service, Morkai's frost-enchanted edge leaving trails of ice crystals in the superheated air around them. Neither combatant fought alone. As the Primarch and Chapter Master clashed at the center of the battlefield, their respective forces engaged in a widening circle around them. Wolfguard Terminators met their World Eaters counterparts in brutal close-quarters combat, Storm Bolters, and Combi weapons, exchanging fire at point-blank range before the engagement devolved into a melee of power fists and chain weapons. The Loyalist Astartes fought with disciplined coordination, while their corrupted counterparts relied on Berserker fury, enhanced by 10 millennia of warp exposure. Beyond this inner circle of transhuman combat, Steel Legion forces engaged the cultist hordes that followed in Angron's wake. Commissar Yarrick directed this battle from the Command Chimera, coordinating artillery strikes and armor movements with characteristic precision. The disciplined volleys of lasgun fire from entrenched infantry positions cut down waves of cultists, whose fanatical charges broke against prepared defensive lines. When breakthrough attempts threatened vulnerable sectors, Yarrick personally led counter-attacks, his power claw claiming dozens of enemies as he inspired the human defenders through both example and the threat of summary execution for those who faltered. The critical moment came 90 minutes into the engagement, when Angron's fury finally overwhelmed Grimnar's defense. A particularly vicious overhead strike from the Black Blade shattered Morkai's haft despite its runic reinforcement, leaving the Great Wolf momentarily unarmed. Before Angron could capitalize on this advantage, however, a new combatant entered the fray, Bjorn the Fell-Handed, his ancient dreadnought chassis moving with surprising agility as he interposed himself between Grimnar and the Daemon Primarch. Bjorn's intervention, while ultimately unsustainable against Angron's power, provided the crucial moments needed for Grimnar to fall back to the secondary line, where Wolfguard veterans waited with a replacement weapon, the axe of Morkai's twin, crafted alongside the original by the same Iron Priest millennia ago, and kept in reserve for this precise contingency. Rearmed, Grimnar rejoined the battle alongside Bjorn, the two ancient warriors coordinating their attacks with the wordless understanding that comes from centuries of battlefield experience. This coordinated defense forced Angron to commit more of his personal power to the physical confrontation, drawing his attention away from the psychic disturbances building around him. Within the Forge Complex's central foundry, Brother Captain Joros and his Grey Knights had begun the banishment ritual, their force weapons driving deeper into the ground as they channeled psychic energy through the prepared matrix. Each Grey Knight functioned as both conduit and stabilizer, their minds linked in perfect synchronization through their chapter's rigorous training. The ritual's initial phases manifested as subtle environmental changes around the battlefield. The perpetual ashfall that characterized Armageddon's atmosphere slowed and then stopped entirely within a 3-kilometer radius of the Forge Complex. Temperature gradients became more extreme, with patches of ground freezing solid while adjacent areas heated to the point where boots sank into softened ferrocrete. Most telling was the effect on the warp-translated demons supporting Angron's assault. Their forms became less substantial, their movements more erratic, as the ritual began to thin the connection between materium and immaterium. Angron sensed the building ritual with the heightened awareness of a being partially existing in both realms simultaneously. His rage, already at apocalyptic levels, focused suddenly on the true threat rather than the space wolves engaging him directly. With a psychic roar that staggered even the transhuman physiology of the Astartes, the Daemon Primarch disengaged from combat with Grimnar and Bjorn, his massive wings propelling him toward the Forge complex with terrible purpose. This moment represented the plan's most vulnerable point. If Angron reached the Grey Knights before the ritual reached its critical threshold, the entire Imperial strategy would collapse. Grimnar had anticipated this development, however, and prepared a contingency that now activated with perfect timing. Hidden throughout the battlefield, linked by prepared teleportation homers, were 5 full squads of Wolfguard in Terminator armor, positioned specifically to intercept Angron should he break through the primary defensive line. These elite warriors teleported directly into the Daemon Primarch's path, materializing in a precise formation that blocked his advance from multiple angles. Their sudden appearance momentarily disoriented even Angron's warp-enhanced senses, creating a crucial opening that the Wolfguard exploited with coordinated fire from storm bolters loaded with blessed ammunition. While these weapons could not seriously harm the Daemon Primarch, the impact of dozens of sanctified rounds striking simultaneously staggered him long enough for the Terminators to close to melee range. What followed was a sacrifice in the truest sense. The Wolfguard knew they could not defeat Angron, merely delay him at the cost of their lives. They fought with the fatalistic courage that characterized the sons of Russ, thunder hammers and power fists striking at the Daemon Primarch's legs, and wings to hamper his mobility rather than attempting killing blows. One by one they fell to the Black Blade or were torn apart by Angron's bare hands, but each death purchased seconds for the ritual to build toward completion. Brother Captain Joros, monitoring the battle through his battle brother's shared consciousness, recognized that the Wolfguard's delay, while heroic, would prove insufficient. The ritual required another 90 seconds to reach the banishment threshold, time that the remaining Terminators could not provide. With the clarity of purpose that defined the Grey Knights, Joros made a tactical decision that violated conventional doctrine, but served the ultimate objective. He detached himself from the ritual circle, leaving 11 battle brothers to maintain the pattern while he personally joined the desperate defense. The thunderous echo of battle still resonated through Armageddon's ravaged atmosphere as Imperial forces secured the final victory over Angron's demonic host. Brother Captain Joros' sacrifice had not been in vain. The Grey Knight's banishment ritual had successfully severed the Daemon Primarch's connection to the material realm, forcing him back into the warp despite his furious resistance. For the first time in months, the skies above Armageddon began to clear, the unnatural storms dissipating as the warp rift gradually sealed itself. Yet even as the last World Eater's warbands were being hunted down by Space Wolves strike teams, a new and more insidious conflict was taking shape within the Imperial command structure. 3 days after Angron's banishment, Inquisitor Lord Hector Rex convened an emergency conclave aboard his flagship, the Emperor's Vigilance. The gathering included representatives from the Ordo Malleus, Ordo Hereticus, and a delegation from the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. Notably absent were any representatives from the Armageddon Steel Legion or planetary government. The conclave's purpose was made clear in Rex's opening declaration. Armageddon has been irreversibly tainted by prolonged demonic presence. Standard containment protocols must be implemented immediately and without exception. With these words, Rex initiated what would become one of the most controversial purges in recent Imperial history. The inquisitorial quarantine began with the establishment of a system-wide cordon. Naval assets that had participated in the defense of Armageddon were commandeered and repositioned to prevent any unauthorized vessels from leaving the system. The black ships of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica took up station in high orbit, their distinctive silhouettes casting ominous shadows over the recovering hive cities below. Planetside, the quarantine manifested as a comprehensive lockdown of all surviving population centers. Inquisitorial stormtroopers, bearing the distinctive black carapace armor of Rex's personal guard, established checkpoints at all major transit hubs. These forces operated under explicit orders. No civilian was to leave their designated zone without proper authorization, and any resistance was to be met with immediate lethal force. The justification for these draconian measures lay in established Ordo Malleus doctrine regarding demonic contamination. According to inquisitorial records, exposure to entities of the warp, even indirect exposure through witnessing such beings, created a permanent risk of corruption. This risk extended beyond immediate possession or worship to include dormant psychic imprints that might manifest generations later, potentially creating new cult activity or serving as conduits for future demonic incursions. From the Inquisition's perspective, the entire population of Armageddon now represented a contamination risk that could not be allowed to spread to other Imperial worlds. The logical conclusion of this assessment led to the implementation of the full Malleus containment protocol. No one who had witnessed the demonic invasion would be permitted to leave Armageddon, ever. Inquisitor Rex established his headquarters in the former governor's palace in Hive Tartarus, converting the ornate audience chamber into a processing center where teams of sanctioned psychers conducted screening procedures on high-value individuals. Those deemed essential to Armageddon's continued productivity, senior administratum officials, Mechanicus tech priests, and certain military officers, underwent invasive mind-scrubbing procedures that erased all memory of the demonic aspects of the invasion, replacing them with sanitized recollections of a more conventional Chaos Space Marine attack. For the vast majority of Armageddon's population, however, no such exceptions were made. Approximately 98% of surviving civilians were classified as exposure-grade vermilion, irreversibly contaminated by warp influence. These individuals were processed through newly established labor assignment centers, where they were registered, implanted with tracking devices, and assigned to specific work details focused on rebuilding the planet's industrial capacity. The most disturbing aspect of the containment protocol was revealed when medical examination teams began processing civilian populations in the refugee camps. All adults of reproductive age were subjected to mandatory sterilization procedures, carried out with ruthless efficiency by Medici teams operating under inquisitorial authority. The rationale, as stated in Rex's Directive 1021 Alpha, was unambiguous. Demonic contamination may manifest genetically across generations. The risk of exponential spread necessitates termination of reproductive capability in all exposed populations. These measures were implemented with minimal explanation to the affected civilians. Most were simply informed that they were receiving standard post-exposure treatment required by Imperial law. Those who questioned the procedures or attempted to resist were immediately detained and transferred to more secure facilities, where more invasive examination methods could determine the extent of their potential corruption. The Steel Legion regiments that had fought so valiantly to defend their homeworld now found themselves in an uncomfortable position. Having witnessed the horrors of demonic warfare firsthand, they too fell under the Inquisition's quarantine restrictions. Veteran companies that had expected reassignment to other war zones were instead ordered to remain on Armageddon indefinitely, serving as enforcement for the new containment protocols. Colonel Starn of the 121st Steel Legion, decorated for his defense of Hive Hellsreach, became one of the first military officers to question these orders. During a command briefing with inquisitorial representatives, Starn pointed out that Imperial Guard regiments had regularly fought against demonic incursions across the galaxy without subsequent quarantine. The inquisitorial response was immediate and chilling. Starn was removed from command and subjected to extensive psychological evaluation to determine whether his objection stemmed from rational analysis or warp contamination. The incident sent a clear message throughout the Imperial chain of command. The Inquisition's authority in this matter was absolute and unquestionable. Other Steel Legion officers, witnessing Starn's fate, kept their misgivings private while outwardly complying with the new directives. This compliance, however reluctant, allowed the containment protocol to proceed without significant military opposition during its initial implementation. The first serious challenge to the Inquisition's authority came not from the planetary forces but from the Space Wolves. Logan Grimnar, recuperating aboard his strike cruiser from wounds sustained in the final battle with Angron, received reports of the quarantine measures from Wolf Scouts maintaining observation positions throughout the Hive cities. The Great Wolf's response was immediate and characteristic, cold fury channeled into strategic action. Grimnar dispatched his most diplomatic Wolf Lord, Gunnar Redmoon, to meet with Inquisitor Rex and ascertain the full scope of the containment protocols. Redmoon's report confirmed Grimnar's worst suspicions. Millions of civilians who had fought bravely against chaos were now being treated as potential heretics, subjected to procedures that violated their dignity and basic imperial rights. The Great Wolf's formal protest to Inquisitor Rex was delivered in person during a tense meeting aboard the Emperor's Vigilance. Grimnar, still bearing the scars of his confrontation with Angron, stood before the assembled inquisitorial conclave and condemned their actions in unequivocal terms. These people fought and bled for the Imperium. They held faith when demons walked their streets. They deserve the Emperor's mercy, not your chains and scalpels. Rex's response was measured but unyielding. He cited numerous historical precedents where failure to properly contain populations exposed to demonic entities had resulted in subsequent chaos outbreaks across multiple sectors. The most notorious example was the Viridian contamination of the 38th millennium, where refugees from a demon-infested world had spread cult activity to 17 other planets before the Inquisition managed to contain the outbreak, at a cost of over 30 billion lives. The fundamental impasse between the Space Wolves and the Inquisition stemmed from irreconcilable perspectives on imperial justice. Grimnar and his chapter viewed loyalty and courage as the ultimate measures of a human's worth to the Imperium. Those who had stood against chaos deserved honor, not punishment. The Inquisition, by contrast, operated on cold risk assessment. Even a 0.1% chance of contamination spreading to multiple worlds represented an unacceptable danger when multiplied across billions of lives. The confrontation escalated when Grimnar announced that Space Wolves vessels would begin evacuating civilians from Armageddon to designated refugee processing centers in the Fenris system, where they could be properly screened without the indignities of the current containment protocol. This direct challenge to inquisitorial authority transformed an ideological disagreement into a potential military conflict between imperial organizations. Inquisitor Rex responded by invoking his emergency authority as senior Ordo Malleus representative in the system. All Space Wolves vessels were ordered to stand down and submit to inquisitorial inspection. Any attempt to transport civilians off-world would be treated as deliberate spread of potential chaos contamination, a capital offense under imperial law. Grimnar's refusal to acknowledge this authority set the stage for what imperial historians would later term the Months of Shame. The Space Wolves strike cruiser Wolf's Eye made the first move in this dangerous game, breaking orbit without authorization and positioning itself to shield several civilian transport vessels that had been prepared for evacuation from Hive Hellsreach. When inquisitorial vessels moved to intercept, the Wolf's Eye powered its weapons but held fire, creating a tense standoff in Armageddon's orbit. The situation deteriorated further when a second Space Wolves vessel, the battle barge Fist of Russ, translated from the warp at the system's edge. The battle barge had been summoned by Grimnar's astropathic message days earlier, its arrival tipping the orbital power balance temporarily in the Space Wolves' favor. Taking advantage of this window, the civilian transports broke from the surface and made for the system's Manville Point, escorted by Space Wolves' Thunderhawk gunships. Inquisitor Rex faced a momentous decision: whether to fire upon vessels of a loyal first founding chapter to prevent what he viewed as a catastrophic breach of quarantine. After brief consultation with his senior staff, Rex gave the order that would escalate the conflict beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. the inquisitorial cruiser Righteous Fury fired warning shots across the bow of the lead transport, demanding immediate compliance. The Space Wolves' response was swift and uncompromising. Thunderhawk gunships launched precision strikes against the Righteous Fury's weapons arrays, disabling its lance batteries without destroying the vessel. This surgical application of force demonstrated both the Space Wolves' superior void combat expertise and their restraint. They could have destroyed the cruiser, but chose to merely neutralize its offensive capability. With the immediate threat to the transports removed, the civilian vessels continued their journey toward the Manville Point. The first successful evacuation transported approximately 4,700 civilians, primarily families of Steel Legion officers and essential administrative personnel from Hive Hellsreach. These evacuees were transferred to Space Wolves vessels waiting at predetermined coordinates, then transported to sanctuary facilities established in the Fenris system. The Inquisition's response to this breach was to escalate both the orbital security and the ground-based containment measures. Additional Navy assets were diverted to the Armageddon system, including the battlecruiser Eternal Vigilance with its complement of Fury interceptors. Planetside, the processing of civilians accelerated, with priority given to those categories deemed most likely to be targeted for Space Wolves evacuation attempts. Of particular concern to the Inquisition were the families of Steel Legion veterans, who represented both a high flight risk and a potential source of divided loyalties among the very forces tasked with enforcing the quarantine. These families were relocated to specialized containment facilities deep within Hive Tartarus, where multiple security layers and constant surveillance made unauthorized access virtually impossible. The sterilization program expanded beyond the initial adult population to include adolescents approaching reproductive age. Medical facilities in all surviving hives were converted to processing centers, where these procedures were carried out with assembly line efficiency. The psychological impact on the affected population was profound. Beyond the physical trauma, the knowledge that they would be the final generation of their bloodlines created a pervasive sense of despair that manifested in increased suicide rates and labor productivity declines. Inquisitor Rex recognized the potential destabilizing effect of this despair and implemented countermeasures that demonstrated the calculated ruthlessness of his approach. Ecclesiarchy priests under inquisitorial direction began preaching a modified imperial creed that framed the sterilization as a form of martyrdom, a sacred sacrifice that protected the wider Imperium from contamination. Those who accepted their fate with appropriate piety were rewarded with improved rations and living conditions, creating a system that incentivized compliance through both spiritual and material means. For those who could not be persuaded, the labor camp system provided a more direct form of control. The camps, officially designated as industrial rehabilitation centers, were established in the ruins of destroyed hive sections and the surrounding ash wastes. Detainees were organized into work battalions focused on rebuilding critical infrastructure, power generation facilities, water purification systems, and manufactoria complexes that would eventually restore Armageddon's industrial output to pre-invasion levels. Conditions within these camps varied according to the assessed contamination risk of their populations. Those classified as low risk, typically civilians who had been in sealed hive sections throughout the invasion, experienced relatively humane treatment, with adequate food, medical care, and defined work periods. Those deemed high risk, individuals who had direct visual contact with demonic entities or who had lived in areas with significant warp presence, faced much harsher conditions, including extended work shifts, minimal rations, and constant surveillance by both human guards and servitor units programmed to detect signs of chaos influence. The Space Wolves continued their evacuation efforts despite increasing inquisitorial opposition. Wolflord Ragnar Blackmane led a particularly daring raid on a processing center in Hive and Furnace, utilizing Thunderhawk gunships in a low-altitude approach that evaded orbital detection until the last possible moment. The raid successfully extracted over 600 civilians, including several Steel Legion officers, who had been detained for questioning the containment protocols. The Inquisition's response to these continuing breaches grew increasingly severe. Naval vessels were now authorized to fire upon evacuee transports with intent to destroy rather than merely disable. This escalation resulted in the first significant casualties of the conflict when the transport vessel Mercy of Tartarus, carrying approximately 400 civilians, was destroyed by lance fire from the inquisitorial cruiser Divine Judgment. The loss of life served only to harden Grimnar's resolve and intensify the Space Wolves' determination to continue their evacuation operations. The conflict reached a critical juncture approximately 3 months after Angron's banishment, when Inquisitor Rex implemented the final phase of his containment strategy. Recognizing that the Space Wolves would continue their evacuation efforts as long as accessible civilian populations remained, Rex ordered the consolidation of all high-risk individuals into 3 primary containment facilities with enhanced security measures, including void shields and automated defense systems, originally designed for Adeptus Mechanicus research installations. These facilities, designated containment zones Alpha, Beta, and Gamma, were constructed using prefabricated components transported from inquisitorial fortress worlds elsewhere in the sector. Each facility could house up to 50,000 detainees in conditions that, while technically meeting basic survival requirements, offered little beyond minimal nutrition and shelter. The psychological design of these facilities was particularly insidious. Layout and lighting patterns subtly reinforced compliance and discouraged independent thought, while constant low-frequency sound patterns disrupted sleep cycles and induced mild disorientation. Most concerning from a humanitarian perspective was the implementation of what inquisitorial documents termed graduated purification protocols. Detainees were subjected to regular screening procedures that included blood sampling, tissue analysis, and psychic examination. Those showing any anomalous results, even minor deviations that might be attributed to stress or malnutrition, were immediately transferred to isolation units for more intensive examination. Few returned from these examinations, and those who did exhibited noticeable personality changes consistent with extensive mind scrubbing procedures. The Space Wolves intelligence network, maintained through both their own Wolf Scouts and sympathetic elements within the Steel Legion, provided Grimnar with detailed information about these facilities. The Great Wolf recognized that the concentrated security would make traditional evacuation raids impractical. Instead, he developed a more comprehensive strategy that would directly challenge the Inquisition's authority rather than merely circumventing it. Grimnar's plan centered on a formal appeal to the High Lords of Terra, bypassing the local inquisitorial authority. Using his status as a first founding chapter master, he compiled extensive documentation of the containment protocols, including picked captures of the sterilization procedures and testimony from evacuees about conditions in the labor camps. This evidence was dispatched via secure astropathic transmission to Terra, accompanied by a formal petition for review of Inquisitor Rex's authority. While awaiting response from Terra, a process that could take months given the warp storm activity still affecting astropathic communication in the region, Grimnar continued more direct opposition to the containment protocols. Space Wolves vessels maintained a constant presence in the Armageddon system, conducting lightning raids against inquisitorial supply convoys and occasionally extracting small groups of civilians from less secured areas. The naval confrontations between Space Wolves and inquisitorial vessels escalated in both frequency and intensity. What had begun as warning shots and targeted strikes against weapon systems evolved into full-scale void combat, with ships on both sides sustaining significant damage. The Space Wolves' superior void combat expertise generally gave them the advantage in these engagements, but the Inquisition's numerical superiority meant that each Space Wolves' victory came at an increasing cost in damage and casualties. A particularly significant engagement occurred when the Space Wolves strike cruiser Winter's Fang attempted to intercept an inquisitorial prison transport carrying detainees to an off-world black ship. The resulting battle involved 5 vessels and lasted nearly 6 hours, with both sides deploying boarding parties and fighter craft. The Winter's Fang eventually succeeded in crippling the transport's engines and extracting approximately 200 prisoners, but sustained such severe damage that it was forced to withdraw from the system for repairs. The conflict's impact extended beyond the immediate participants to affect other Imperial organizations operating in the Armageddon system. The Adeptus Mechanicus, which had begun the process of reconsecrating and reactivating damaged manufactoria, found their work repeatedly interrupted by security operations and occasional void battles in close orbit. Several key tech priests formally protested to both the Inquisition and the Space Wolves, demanding that their conflict be conducted in a manner that did not interfere with the Omnissiah's work. Similarly, the Ecclesiarchy found itself in an uncomfortable position between the competing authorities. While officially supporting the Inquisition's containment measures as necessary for spiritual purity, many individual priests who had witnessed the courage of Armageddon's defenders during the invasion harbored doubts about the justice of their subsequent treatment. Some quietly provided information to Space Wolves operatives about upcoming transport movements or security changes, their conscience overriding their institutional loyalty. The Steel Legion regiments, still officially under inquisitorial authority for quarantine enforcement, experienced increasing internal division as the conflict progressed. Junior officers, particularly those with family members in the containment facilities, became increasingly sympathetic to the Space Wolves' position. Several company-level commanders deliberately created security gaps during their assigned patrols, allowing Space Wolves' extraction teams to operate with minimal opposition. Senior officers, more conscious of the potential consequences of outright insubordination, generally maintained official compliance while finding subtle ways to undermine the more extreme aspects of the containment protocols. Requisition officers miscalculated supply needs for the labor camps, resulting in improved rations. Medical officers diagnosed contamination-resistant physiologies in selected detainees, exempting them from sterilization procedures. These small acts of resistance, while insufficient to challenge the overall system, created a network of exceptions that preserved some measure of humanity within the containment regime. The most significant development in this shadow conflict came when a mid-ranking inquisitor named Gesme Cisneros arrived in the Armageddon system, with orders directly from the High Lords of Terra. Cisneros, a politically astute operator with connections to multiple factions within the Inquisition, had been dispatched to resolve the increasingly embarrassing conflict between a first founding chapter and the Ordo Malleus. Cisneros' arrival changed the dynamic of the conflict in ways that neither Grimnar nor Rex had anticipated. Rather than immediately taking sides, the new Inquisitor established a neutral command post aboard his personal vessel and invited representatives from both factions to present their positions. This approach, framing the dispute as a matter for mediation rather than a question of absolute authority, created an opening for potential de-escalation. However, the fundamental disagreement remained unresolved. The Space Wolves would not accept the continued imprisonment and sterilization of loyal Imperial citizens, while the Inquisition would not risk potential chaos contamination spreading beyond Armageddon. Cisneros' attempted compromise, allowing limited evacuations of low-risk individuals to designated quarantine worlds, satisfied neither party and was rejected by both Grimnar and Rex. The stalemate continued, with periodic naval clashes and extraction operations maintaining a constant state of tension throughout the system. The civilian population, caught between these competing Imperial authorities, endured their containment with the grim resilience that characterized Armageddon's people. In work camps and processing centers across the planet, they continued to rebuild their world even as they were denied any hope for their own futures. This dark chapter in Armageddon's history would continue for months more, with neither side willing to concede their fundamental position. As the dust settled across Armageddon's blasted plains, the true impact of the First War began to manifest in ways that would reshape the planet's future for millennia to come. The once mighty industrial powerhouse lay in ruins, with 7 of its 12 major hive cities either completely destroyed or damaged beyond practical repair. The northern continent of Armageddon Prime suffered the worst devastation, with nearly 70% of its manufacturing capacity reduced to twisted metal and shattered rockcrete. Hive Volcanus, the epicenter of the demonic invasion, remained an uninhabitable wasteland where strange phenomena continued to manifest despite the Grey Knight's purification rituals. The human cost proved even more staggering. Population assessments conducted by administratum census teams in the war's aftermath revealed that approximately 58% of Armageddon's pre-invasion population had perished, either directly from combat or through the subsequent starvation, disease, and exposure that followed the collapse of hive infrastructure. The survivors concentrated in the remaining functional hives faced severe resource shortages, particularly of clean water and uncontaminated food. Mechanicus estimates suggested that full recovery of Armageddon's industrial output would require at least 3 decades of intensive reconstruction, assuming optimal resource allocation and workforce availability. Yet despite these catastrophic losses, the Imperium's strategic calculus remained unchanged. Armageddon's position at the nexus of critical warp routes made it too valuable to abandon. Within weeks of Angron's banishment, Mechanicus exploitation teams were already surveying the ruins, identifying salvageable machinery, and prioritizing reconstruction efforts. The surviving hives saw an influx of technical specialists from nearby forge worlds, accompanied by labor gangs comprised of penal legionnaires and indentured workers. These reconstruction crews worked around the clock, often in hazardous conditions where structural collapse or toxic exposure claimed nearly as many lives as the war itself had in some areas. The strategic importance of Armageddon actually increased following the First War, as Imperial military planners recognized the planet's demonstrated vulnerability to chaos incursion. Defense installations that had been neglected under Governor von Straub's administration received priority in the reconstruction effort. New orbital defense platforms, built to Mechanicus Theta pattern specifications, were positioned in geosynchronous orbit above major population centers. These platforms featured enhanced void shields and significant firepower, capable of engaging both planetary and void-based threats. Planet-side defenses underwent similar enhancement. The Hellsreach coastal fortress, which had repelled multiple World Eaters' assaults during the invasion, was rebuilt on an even larger scale, incorporating lessons learned during the conflict. New defensive networks included overlapping fields of fire, hardened bunker complexes resistant to both conventional and warp-based weapons, and extensive subterranean command facilities designed to maintain operational capability, even if surface installations were overrun. The Steel Legion regiments that had defended Armageddon emerged from the conflict transformed by their experience. Survivors who had faced demonic entities and lived developed specialized combat doctrines that would be incorporated into Imperial Guard training manuals across the sector. Particularly notable was the Hellsreach Protocol for urban defense against warp entities, which emphasized flexible defensive lines, prepared fallback positions, and the psychological preparation necessary for troops to maintain combat effectiveness when facing supernatural horrors. These veterans formed the core of an expanded Steel Legion that would become one of the Imperium's premier fighting forces in subsequent centuries. Their combat experience against both Chaos Space Marines and demonic entities made them particularly valuable in similar conflicts across the segmentum. Steel Legion officers who had served under Commissar Yarrick during the First War were highly sought after as instructors at Schola Progenium facilities, where their first-hand accounts provided invaluable training material for future generations of Imperial officers. Yarrick himself emerged from the conflict as a living legend, his successful defense of Armageddon against a Daemon Primarch elevating him to hero status throughout the sector. Though offered prestigious positions within the commissariat's upper echelons, he chose to remain on Armageddon, overseeing the rebuilding of the planet's defenses and the training of its military forces. His presence provided continuity and stability during the tumultuous reconstruction period, his authority respected by imperial organizations that might otherwise have pursued conflicting agendas at the expense of effective recovery. The political aftermath of the First War extended far beyond Armageddon itself, creating ripple effects throughout imperial power structures. The most immediate consequence was the permanent removal of Hermann von Straub from power. The former governor faced a tribunal composed of representatives from the Administratum, Commissariat, and Inquisition, which unanimously found him guilty of criminal negligence and dereliction of duty. The sentence, death by firing squad, was carried out in the central plaza of Hive Tartarus, with the execution broadcast throughout the surviving hives as a stark reminder of the consequences of failure in imperial leadership. The von Straub dynasty, which had ruled Armageddon for generations, was permanently stripped of all authority and assets. Distant relatives who might have claimed succession rights were thoroughly investigated by the Inquisition and either executed for complicity in von Straub's failures or exiled to remote imperial worlds where they could pose no further threat to efficient governance. This decisive purge of a once powerful noble house sent shockwaves through the aristocratic hierarchies of neighboring systems, prompting many planetary governors to demonstrably increase investment in defense infrastructure to avoid similar fates. The most profound and long-lasting political consequence of the First War, however, was the bitter conflict between the Space Wolves and the Inquisition. What began as a disagreement over the treatment of Armageddon's civilian population escalated into a shadow war that would poison relations between these imperial organizations for centuries to come. The Space Wolves, led by Logan Grimnar, fundamentally rejected the Inquisition's position that any civilian who had witnessed demonic manifestation represented a contamination risk requiring permanent quarantine or elimination. This ideological divide exposed a fundamental tension within imperial governance, the balance between security and humanity. The Inquisition, tasked with protecting the Imperium from existential threats, operated from a position that no risk was acceptable when it came to potential chaos contamination. The Space Wolves, while equally committed to the Imperium's defense, maintained that loyalty and courage should be rewarded, not punished with imprisonment or worse. The practical consequences of this conflict manifested in the Inquisition's implementation of increasingly stringent information control protocols for subsequent demonic incursions. Civilian witnesses to such events faced mind-wiping procedures at best and summary execution at worst, while military personnel received only sanitized briefings that omitted critical information about the true nature of their opponents. This policy of deliberate ignorance, while reducing the risk of chaos knowledge spreading, also hampered the Imperium's ability to effectively prepare for and counter similar threats in the future. For the Space Wolves, the aftermath of the First War marked the beginning of an increasingly strained relationship with Imperial authority in general. While they remained unquestionably loyal to the Emperor and the Imperium he had created, their trust in the organizations administering that Imperium was permanently damaged. This mistrust manifested in increased autonomy in their operations and a reluctance to fully integrate into joint imperial campaigns without substantial guarantees regarding command authority and operational independence. The spiritual impact of the First War on Armageddon's population created enduring changes to the planet's religious landscape. Those who had witnessed demonic entities firsthand could never fully reconcile such experiences with the standard imperial creed's limited acknowledgement of chaos. In response to this cognitive dissonance, several distinct religious movements emerged among the survivors, each attempting to integrate the traumatic reality they had experienced into a coherent theological framework. The Purified, the largest of these movements, developed around the belief that Armageddon's people had been tested by direct exposure to the Emperor's enemies and emerged stronger for the experience. Their practices emphasized ritual cleansing, both physical and spiritual, and the maintenance of constant vigilance against corruption. While technically compliant with orthodox imperial teaching, the Purified incorporated elements of paranoia and self-mortification that occasionally brought them into conflict with standard ecclesiarchy authorities. More concerning to imperial authorities was the emergence of the Witnesses of the Blood Tide, a secretive cult that formed in the underhives of Tartarus and Infernus. This group interpreted the demonic invasion not as a test, but as a revelation, believing that the conventional imperial understanding of reality had been exposed as incomplete. While not explicitly chaos-worshipping, their obsessive documentation and study of the invasion's supernatural aspects repeatedly attracted inquisitorial attention, resulting in periodic purges that nonetheless failed to completely eradicate the movement. The ecclesiarchy responded to these spiritual challenges with an unprecedented mobilization of resources. New cathedrals were constructed in all surviving hives, their architecture deliberately imposing to reinforce the church's authority. Missionary teams conducted block-by-block re-education programs, combining theological instruction with practical assistance in reconstruction efforts to build goodwill among the population. Particularly effective were the Orders Hospitaller, whose medical missions provided care for the injured and ill while simultaneously reinforcing orthodox imperial teachings. This spiritual campaign extended to the reorganization of Armageddon's calendar and public ceremonies. The date of Angron's banishment became Salvation Day, a planet-wide celebration featuring military parades, public prayer services, and reenactments of key battles carefully sanitized of any accurate depiction of demonic entities. Similarly, the day of the initial warp breach was designated as the Day of Vigilance, marked by fasting, prayer, and public recommitment to imperial defense protocols. The psychological scars left by the First War manifested in ways both obvious and subtle. Rates of stress disorders, paranoia, and psychosomatic illness remained elevated for decades after the conflict, particularly among those who had directly witnessed demonic manifestations. Medical facilities in all major hives maintained specialized treatment wards for what became known as warp shock, a constellation of symptoms including persistent nightmares, sensory hallucinations, and episodes of dissociation that affected approximately 15% of the adult survivor population. Children who had lived through the invasion developed distinct psychological adaptations that shaped Armageddon's culture for generations. Studies conducted by Schola Progenium assessors noted that these children displayed heightened vigilance, exceptional pattern recognition, and an unusual capacity for compartmentalizing traumatic experiences. These traits, while problematic in some contexts, proved advantageous in Armageddon's post-war environment, where the ability to function amid ongoing hardship and danger was essential for survival. The long-term preparation for future conflicts became a defining feature of Armageddon's reconstruction. Unlike many worlds that experienced devastating attacks and then returned to normal operations once the immediate threat passed, Armageddon institutionalized permanent war readiness at every level of society. This militarization extended far beyond conventional defense forces to permeate civilian infrastructure and social organization. Educational curricula for all age groups incorporated extensive defense training, with children as young as 5 learning basic shelter protocols and emergency response procedures. By adolescence, all Armageddon citizens received weapons training, chemical warfare preparation, and indoctrination in resistance techniques should their hive be occupied by enemy forces. This universal military education created a population that could rapidly transition from civilian production to effective militia defense when needed. Industrial reconstruction prioritized facilities that could easily convert between civilian and military production. New manufactoria featured modular assembly lines that could switch from civilian vehicles to chimera transports within hours, while chemical plants were designed to pivot from agricultural fertilizers to explosives with minimal retooling. This dual-use approach maximized Armageddon's economic recovery while ensuring that future invasions would face a planet capable of sustaining its own defense industrial base. Urban planning similarly reflected lessons from the First War. New hive construction and the reconstruction of damaged sections followed defense in-depth principles, with concentric security zones, hardened shelter areas, and pre-sited artillery positions integrated into the basic urban layout. Transportation networks included redundant systems and hidden emergency routes, while water and power distribution incorporated isolated subsystems that could maintain essential services even if main networks were compromised. Perhaps most significant for Armageddon's future was how the experience of the First War influenced the planet's leadership culture. The catastrophic failure of Hermann von Straub created an institutional aversion to any form of leadership that prioritized personal privilege over practical preparation. Subsequent planetary governors, whether appointed by the Administratum or emerging from local power structures, operated under the shadow of von Straub's example, knowing that any perceived negligence in defense matters would be met with immediate and harsh consequences. This leadership transformation extended to the relationship between military and civilian authorities. Where von Straub had marginalized and ignored his military advisors, post-war governance structures formally incorporated defense considerations into all major decision-making. The commander of the Steel Legion held a permanent position on the Planetary Ruling Council, with authority to veto any policy deemed detrimental to Armageddon's security. This arrangement occasionally created tension with production-focused Administratum officials, but prevented the dangerous separation between civilian leadership and military reality that had proved so catastrophic during the First War. As Armageddon rebuilt and decades passed, the immediate horror of the First War gradually transformed into something more complex, a founding mythology that shaped the planet's identity and purpose. The successful defense against a Daemon Primarch, despite the terrible cost, became a source of grim pride for Armageddon's people. They had faced one of the Imperium's most terrible enemies and survived, not through luck or external salvation, but through their own sacrifice and determination. This hard-earned identity would be tested again and again in the centuries that followed, as Armageddon faced new invasions and challenges. The lessons of the First War, both those learned and those tragically ignored, would echo through these subsequent conflicts, influencing strategies, decisions, and outcomes in ways that would continue to shape the destiny of this embattled world at the heart of the Imperium's defense.